He didn't even look at her when he did it. 300 guests, 12-tier cake, champagne chilled to exactly the right temperature. Vivian had made sure of that herself. And while the string quartet played the song she had personally selected, while the fairy lights she had strung across the terrace glittered above a crowd in their finest clothes, Duke Adrian Blackwood crossed the dance floor, took the hand of a 24-year-old woman named Celeste Vane, and pulled her into the center of the room. Not to dance, to introduce her. "I want everyone to meet someone very important to me," he said, his voice amplified through the speakers Vivian had arranged. "Celeste has made this past year the best of my life." Vivian was standing 12 feet away, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched. If this story moves something in you, if you've ever been invisible in the one place you were supposed to matter most, please like this video, drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and stay with me all the way to the end. Let's begin. The party had been Vivian's idea. Not originally. Nothing about Adrian's life was ever originally her idea, at least not in any way he would have acknowledged. But the birthday celebration, the venue, the guest list of 312 people drawn from finance, politics, old money, and new ambition, all of that had moved from concept to reality through her hands. She had spent 11 weeks on the details. The terrace of Ashford Manor had been transformed into something out of a period film. White draped linen, fresh gardenias, candles inside hand-blown glass vessels she'd sourced from a small workshop outside of Charleston. The menu had been rebuilt 3 times to accommodate a changing list of dietary restrictions among the guests. The security detail had been briefed. The parking arrangement had been coordinated with the city. Vivian had done all of it the way she had done everything for the past 8 years, thoroughly, invisibly, and without once being asked how she was holding up. She was 36 years old and had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours in 14 days. She stood near the east end of the terrace when Adrian made his announcement, close enough to the low stone railing that she could feel the night air rising from the garden below. Lila was upstairs with her nanny, already in bed. Vivian had kissed her daughter at 8 o'clock, tucked the blanket around her shoulders, and come back down to the party in the blue silk dress she'd bought for the occasion, the one Adrian had not commented on when she'd walked past him in the hallway. She heard his voice before she understood what he was saying. "I want everyone to meet someone very important to me." The crowd shifted, heads turned, and Vivian turned too because that was what you did. You turned, you looked, you paid attention. She was good at paying attention. Celeste Vane was wearing red. That registered first somehow. The dress was a deep arterial red, cut low, and the woman inside it was young in the way that announces itself without effort. Smooth skin, a certain ease in the shoulders, the unconscious confidence of someone who has never yet had to fight for a room's attention. She had dark hair pinned loosely at the neck, and she was smiling at something Adrian said into her ear, and the smile was not performed. It was the smile of someone who knew they were exactly where they wanted to be. "Celeste has made this past year the best of my life." The words went through the room like something dropped from a height. Vivian watched 300 people absorb the sentence. She watched Margot Ellison, who had been her friend since before the marriage, go absolutely still. She watched Congressman Hargrove's wife look away. She watched the sommelier near the drinks table stop pretending to arrange bottles. The string quartet did not stop playing, but the violinist's bow dragged slightly, the way a person's step falters when they hear something they weren't prepared for. Adrian's hand was at the small of Celeste's back. He still had not looked at Vivian. That was the part she would think about later. Not what he said, not the dress, not the 300 witnesses. The part she would return to in the weeks and months that followed was that he had not looked at her once. Not in warning, not in apology, not even in the way a person looks at something they're afraid of. He had simply not looked. She was furniture. She was the terrace. She was the gardenias and the hand-blown glass and the menu that had been rebuilt 3 times. She was the woman who had built the room he was standing in, and he had not once turned to find her face. Vivian set her champagne glass on the stone railing. She did it carefully, without sound. The glass was still full, and it caught the candlelight, and she thought, absurdly, that it was a pretty thing, that someone had made it with care and it deserved not to be dropped. Then she reached up and touched the back of her left hand. Her wedding ring was a 3-carat emerald-cut diamond set in platinum, chosen by Adrian's mother, fitted to Vivian's finger the week before the ceremony. She had worn it for 8 years. It had become part of the topography of her hand, something she felt more than saw, something that was simply there the way her own knuckles were there. She worked it off slowly. It took a moment. Her fingers were slightly swollen from the heat, but then it came free, and she held it in her palm, and it was heavier than she remembered. Or maybe she had just forgotten what it felt like to actually hold it rather than wear it. She walked across the terrace. The crowd parted, not quickly, but steadily, the way a crowd moves when it senses that something is happening that it cannot yet classify. Some people stepped aside without looking. Others looked and then looked away. A few simply froze. Adrian saw her coming when she was about 8 feet away. She watched his expression shift, not to guilt, not to fear, to annoyance, a brief tightening of the jaw that meant she was doing something inconvenient. Celeste Vane saw her a moment later, and the smile on her face did not exactly disappear. It recalibrated, adjusted into something more careful, more watchful. Vivian stopped in front of them both. She did not raise her voice. The quartet was still playing, something Viennese, technically precise, and she did not feel the need to compete with it. She held out the ring, not to Adrian, to Celeste. "You should have this," Vivian said. "You've clearly already been given everything else." The room was not silent. That was the strange thing. The music continued. Somewhere across the terrace, a man laughed at something before realizing the timing, and the laugh collapsed into a cough. Ice shifted in a bucket, but inside that ambient noise there was a quality of held breath so complete it felt like pressure in the ears. Celeste looked at the ring in Vivian's palm. She did not take it. Adrian said, "Vivian, don't." Her voice was quiet and very even. "Don't do the thing where you tell me I'm making a scene. You made the scene. I'm just the last one to find out where I'm standing in it." She set the ring on the ledge of a nearby table, a long white draped table holding dessert plates and small forks, and placed it there with the same care she had used on the champagne glass. Because she was, at her core, a person who put things down carefully. Then she turned and walked back through the crowd toward the house. She heard Adrian say her name once more, behind her, but the word had no traction. It moved through her without catching. Med. The house felt different when you were the only one in it who knew you were leaving. Vivian climbed the back staircase rather than the main one, a habit from 8 years of managing a household without needing to be seen doing it. The back stairs were narrower and slightly drafty, and they smelled faintly of the wood polish Mrs. Chen applied every Tuesday. She knew every creak and every step. She had listened to them in the dark often enough. Lila was asleep. She lay on her side with both arms curled beneath the pillow, her dark hair, Adrian's hair, which Vivian had always found both poignant and inconvenient to notice, fanned across the white linen. She breathed in the slow, uncomplicated way of children who have not yet learned to carry the night with them. Vivian sat on the edge of the bed and watched her daughter breathe for a long time. She was not crying. She had noticed that about herself and found it strange. She expected to be crying. Instead, there was something quieter in her chest, something that felt almost geological, a shift in the deep material of things, slow and irreversible. She touched Lila's shoulder gently. "Lila?" Softer. "Sweetheart." Lila surfaced slowly the way she always did, a gradual assembling of consciousness, small blinks, a brief frown. "Mama? We're going to Grandma Nell's tonight." A pause. Lila was 8 and perceptive in the way children are when they have spent their formative years in a house where the adults don't argue, where the absence of argument is itself a kind of noise. Now? Now. Is something wrong? Vivian looked at her daughter's face in the low glow of the nightlight, its plastic shape a small hedgehog that Lila had chosen at a gas station 2 summers ago and which had traveled with them everywhere since. She thought about what to say. She thought about all the things parents say in these moments that children know aren't quite true. "Some things are changing," she said. "But you're safe, and I've got you, and we're going to be okay." Lila studied her for a moment with those dark eyes. Then she sat up and said, "Can I bring the hedgehog light?" "Of course you can." All right. Eleanor Sterling, Nell to everyone, including her own reflection, lived 20 minutes from Ashford Manor in a house she had owned since before Vivian's father was born. It was a compact two-story on a street of similar houses, with a front porch that sagged slightly on the left side, and a kitchen that smelled permanently of the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Nell was 71 and slept lightly and answered the door 3 minutes after Vivian knocked, which meant she had not been asleep at all. She took one look at Vivian standing on the porch with a sleeping Lila in her arms and a single bag at her feet. "Come in," she said. Just that. She heated milk without being asked. She made up the guest bed with the flannel sheets, the ones she kept in the cedar chest for Lila, because the child ran cold even in summer. She tucked Lila in while Vivian stood in the doorway, and she did all of this without asking a single question, which was one of the things Vivian had always loved most about her grandmother. In the kitchen, over mugs of warm milk Vivian didn't particularly want, but held anyway because it gave her hands something to do, Nell finally spoke. "Adrian." "At his party," Vivian said. He introduced her, to the whole room. Nell was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen wall. "How long have you known?" Vivian looked into her mug. "I suspected. Maybe 8 months. I didn't push on it because—" She stopped. "I don't know why I didn't push on it." "You were managing things," Nell said. It wasn't a criticism. It was just what Nell did. She named things accurately and without decoration. "I'm always managing things." "You built that whole enterprise." "I know." And he stood in front of 300 people and— "I left the ring on a dessert table," Vivian said, and then unexpectedly, absurdly, she laughed. A short, involuntary sound that surprised her. "On the table with the petite four. I hope someone stepped on it." Nell looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Good." The morning after the party, Vivian's phone began ringing at 7:43 and did not stop. She had turned it to silent, but it kept lighting up on Nell's kitchen table. Names she recognized, numbers she didn't. Margot called 3 times. A man she'd worked with on the Blackwood Foundation's last charitable audit, Harrison Ford, left a voicemail she didn't yet listen to. One of the party caterers called, which she thought was odd until she remembered she was technically the one who had signed the catering contract. Adrian called once at 8:15, and when she didn't answer, he did not call again. She sat across from Lila, who was eating toast with the focused seriousness of a child who senses that the adults around her are holding something, and who has decided, with great dignity, to concentrate on the toast. "Are we going home today?" Lila asked without looking up. "Not today." A small nod. The toast continued. "Is Daddy going to call?" Vivian considered the question. "Maybe," she said. "If he calls, I'll tell you." Lila looked up then, and her expression was complicated for an 8-year-old's face. Too much in it, too many moving parts. "Is this like when Mrs. Harmon's husband went to live somewhere else, and she had to explain about families?" Mrs. Harmon was Lila's 2nd-grade teacher. Vivian made a mental note to send her a card because apparently she had handled something difficult in a way that was still resonating 8 months later. "Something like that," Vivian said, "but I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here." "That part doesn't change." Lila seemed to absorb this, then, "Can I have another piece of toast?" "You can have as many pieces as you want." Vivian called her attorney at 9 o'clock. Diana Marsh had been Vivian's attorney since before the Blackwood marriage. She had handled Vivian's first employment contracts when Vivian was still working as a financial analyst, back when she had been someone who went to an office and had her own name on things. Diana was 53, relentlessly precise, and had a gift for asking the questions that made you realize what you had not yet thought to consider. "Tell me what you have, Jason," Diana said, once Vivian had given her a summary. 8 years of financial records, Vivian said. The Blackwood estate accounts, the foundation records, the operating documents for 3 subsidiary companies. I maintained all of them. "You have access to these records?" "I have copies. I've kept copies off-site since the beginning, partly out of habit, partly because—" She paused, trying to locate the honest answer. "Because somewhere in me I always knew that if this fell apart, no one was going to advocate for me. Adrian's people are his people. His legal team has been on retainer for 30 years. Diana said nothing for a moment, the particular silence of someone making notes. What do the records show? Multiple things. Some of them, Vivian chose the next word carefully. Complicated. Meaning? Meaning I spent 8 years keeping very accurate books for a household and a business that was not always being run honestly. Vivian, Diana's voice was even. Be specific. There are payments in the estate accounts that don't correspond to legitimate vendors. There are foundation transactions that were processed as charitable disbursements but went to private accounts. There are 3 properties listed under shell companies that don't appear anywhere in Adrian's official financial disclosures. She paused. And there are communications, emails I was copied on, documents I countersigned, meeting minutes I prepared, that show who knew about it and when. Silence. How long have you had this material? Diana asked. All of it? Since I started noticing things that didn't add up, about 4 years ago. I started keeping a parallel record system after that, noting discrepancies, filing copies. Did anyone know you were doing this? No. Did Adrian know? I don't think so. I was very careful. I didn't know exactly why I was being careful. I think I told myself it was just professional habit, but I kept it all. Diana exhaled slowly. Okay, here's what I need you to understand going forward. The minute you file for divorce, or the minute Adrian does, this becomes a legal landscape, not a personal one. Everything you just told me becomes evidence or leverage or both. The people whose names are in those documents are going to be very motivated to complicate your life. I know. Do you? Diana, I spent 8 years living inside a house where everyone underestimated me. I've thought about this more carefully than they expect. She looked out Nell's kitchen window at the small square of back garden, the tomato plants Nell was attempting for the 3rd consecutive summer with limited success. I'm not trying to burn anything down. I just want my daughter, my dignity, and a clean exit. Another pause. All right, Diana said. Come to my office this afternoon. Bring everything you have. The story of the ring traveled, as these stories do. By noon, it had become the kind of thing that people in certain circles were sending to each other in clipped, careful language. Did you hear about the Blackwood party? The punctuation doing most of the emotional work? By evening, there were 2 versions. One that positioned Vivian as an unhinged woman who had staged a breakdown at her husband's birthday, and one that positioned her as someone who had responded to a public humiliation with a composure that people found, depending on their own histories, either admirable or unnerving. Adrian's publicist released a brief statement through one of the estate's standard communications channels. It said nothing specific, acknowledged nothing, and used the phrase private matter twice in 3 sentences, which was the communications equivalent of a hand waved in front of a bright light. Celeste Vane was photographed leaving Ashford Manor the following morning. She was wearing sunglasses and carrying a weekender bag, and she looked, to the person who took the photograph from across the street, neither guilty nor triumphant, more like someone who had been in a situation that was more complicated than they had expected and was proceeding with practical caution. Vivian did not see this photograph until several days later. When she did, she looked at it for a long time without feeling much. The woman in it was 24. She had entered a situation that someone older had constructed and maintained, and she was now walking out of it into morning light, and whatever she understood about what had happened, she would likely understand more eventually. That was, Vivian thought, simply the arithmetic of time. Diana Marsh's office was in a mid-century building downtown with windows that faced west. It was almost 4 in the afternoon when Vivian arrived, and the light was coming in flat and heavy through the glass, falling across the conference table where Diana had arranged herself with a yellow legal pad and a coffee that had long since gone cold. Vivian sat down and opened the bag she'd brought, a canvas tote, not a briefcase, because she'd left quickly and had not packed for what this was becoming, and she set a 6-inch stack of file folders on the table. Diana looked at the stack. That's the first set, Vivian said. How many sets are there? 3. These are the foundation records from the last 4 years. The second set is the estate account documentation with the discrepancy log I maintained. The third set is correspondence, printed copies of emails and meeting notes. Diana reached for the top folder, opened it, and began to read. Vivian sat across from her and waited. She was good at waiting. 8 years of managing things had made her very good at the specific skill of inhabiting the space between actions without filling it unnecessarily. After several minutes, Diana looked up. "These are your personal annotations?" "In the margins, yes." "And this?" Diana pointed to a line of figures. "This transaction is the one that connects to the Shell account?" "Yes, there are 3 of them in that folder. They all move through the same routing structure, but they're filed under different project names. You'll see that the project names correspond to the Foundation's charitable initiatives, but none of those initiatives received the amounts shown." Diana set the folder down and looked at Vivian directly. "Do you understand that what you have here is significant?" Vivian said. "More than significant. This is criminal exposure for multiple parties." "I know. People are going to come after you for this." "They'll come after me anyway," Vivian said. "That's what happens when a woman leaves a powerful man. You become the problem to be managed. I'd rather give them a reason to be careful about how they manage me." Diana was quiet for a moment. "Is that what this is? Insurance?" Vivian thought about the question. She thought about the 4 years she had spent maintaining a parallel record system in the margins of a marriage, writing small, precise notes in folders that lived in a safety deposit box across town. She thought about why she had done it, what she had told herself at the time. "Honestly," she said, "I think I kept records because keeping records was the only thing in that house that was entirely mine. It was the one place where I got to decide what counted and what didn't." She paused. "But yes, it's insurance. I'd like to not need it, but I would like to have it." Diana nodded slowly. She picked up the second folder. "All right," she said. "Tell me about Adrian's legal team." She found a house to rent within the week. It was not a large house. That was the thing about leaving an estate. Every subsequent space felt architectural rather than just modest. The rental was a 2-bedroom on Aldrich Street, 1,400 square feet, with hardwood floors that needed refinishing and a kitchen with narrow counter space and a yard that was more accurately described as a strip of grass with ambitions. The upstairs had 2 bedrooms separated by a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that Lila declared with great authority to be the best thing she had ever seen. Vivian stood in the kitchen the first evening and looked around and tried to locate the feeling she expected to have: diminishment, loss, the particular grief of arriving somewhere smaller than where you'd been. She waited for it. It didn't come. What came instead was silence that she had chosen. The quiet of a house where there was no one she needed to account for, no obligation that preceded her, no ambient tension she'd been navigating without admitting she was navigating it. Lila was upstairs investigating the clawfoot tub with the hedgehog nightlight plugged in beside it. Vivian opened one of the moving boxes and began to unpack. The first call from Adrian's legal team came on a Wednesday. The attorney's name was Prescott Hale, senior partner at a firm that had represented the Blackwood estate since before Adrian was born, a fact he managed to communicate within the first 90 seconds of the conversation without technically saying it outright. He had the voice of a man accustomed to being the most formidable person on the phone. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "I'd like to speak with you directly before this becomes a matter of formal correspondence." "I have an attorney," Vivian said. "Diana Marsh. You can speak with her." "Of course. That's your prerogative. I'm simply—" "Mr. Hale." She kept her voice level. "Whatever you were going to say that you thought might be better said before anything was formal, say it to Diana." A pause. Not a long one. Just long enough to communicate that he was recalibrating. "Of course," he said again. "I'll be in touch with Miss Marsh." She hung up and called Diana. "They're trying to get ahead of something," Diana said when Vivian had recounted the call. "What exactly depends on what they think you have." "They don't know what I have." "Not yet, but they'll figure out quickly that you were the one maintaining the records. That's the first thing they'll think about." "What do they do when they figure that out?" "Depends on how smart they are," Diana said. "The smart move is to make this as simple and clean as possible, reach a settlement that keeps you quiet, protects their client, and gets resolved before anything sees a courtroom. The less smart move is to come at you aggressively and hope they can overwhelm you. And if they're not smart, then we use what you have." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Outside her window on Aldrich Street, a man was walking a dog, a large, uncoordinated yellow dog that seemed to be conducting an investigation of every object within a 3-foot radius of the sidewalk. She watched them move past slowly. "What should I expect?" she asked. "Honestly, I expect them to file some kind of preemptive motion around the financial records, try to establish that your access to those documents was unauthorized or that any copies you made are inadmissible. It won't work, but it will cost time and money and create pressure." "Let it." "You're sure?" Vivian thought about 8 years. She thought about the ring on the dessert table, the hand-blown glass vessels, the menu rebuilt 3 times, 11 weeks of invisible work that had produced a party beautiful enough to be used as the backdrop for her own public humiliation. "I'm very sure," she said. The second week on Aldrich Street, Lila started at a new school. The school was called Meridian Elementary, and it was 4 blocks from the house, close enough to walk on good mornings, which Vivian was determined to make a habit of, the walking. They went together the first morning, Lila's backpack a little too large for her frame, Vivian with a travel mug of coffee, and the particular alertness of a person who has just reorganized their life and is still calibrating the new rhythms. Lila said very little on the walk. She was 8, and she was processing, and she processed privately. Another thing that had come unambiguously from Vivian's side of the family. At the school gate, she stopped. "What if I don't know anybody?" she said. "You won't at first," Vivian said. "That's just how it starts." "What if they don't like me?" Vivian crouched down to Lila's level, which meant she was also now eye level with the too large backpack and its small yellow bear keychain, a gift from Nell. "Some of them might not," she said. "Some people don't click right away, and that's real, but some of them will. And the ones that do, those are the ones worth knowing." Lila considered this with the solemn empiricism of a child who has been told not to look for easy comfort. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay," Vivian agreed. She watched Lila walk through the gate. She watched her daughter's back grow smaller and then disappear through the school's front door. Then she stood up and finished her coffee and walked back to the house on Aldrich Street where there was work to do. There was always work to do. And she sat down at the kitchen table with the narrow counter space and the yard with ambitions, and she opened her laptop, and she began. What she began was not, at first, visible to anyone. It was a document, a timeline, initially, a simple linear accounting of events and transactions and decisions, organized by date, cross-referenced against the folders she had brought from the safety deposit box. She had been building this thing in fragments for years, in the margins of other tasks, late at night after Lila was in bed and Adrian was somewhere else and the large quiet house being somewhere else. She had never finished it because finishing it would have required deciding what it was for. Now she knew what it was for. She worked steadily through the morning, adding notation, adding context, organizing. She was a person who understood that in any dispute, the person with the clearest documentation wins, not always in court, not always immediately, but structurally over time. Evidence was patient. Evidence could wait. She was still working when her phone buzzed with a text from Margot. "I keep trying to call. Are you okay?" Vivian looked at the message for a moment. Margot had been a genuine friend, was still, probably, but Margot was also embedded in the same social network that surrounded Adrian, the same dinner parties and charitable boards and school fundraisers, and Vivian did not yet know who in that network was a friend and who was a messenger. She typed back, "I'm okay. Give me a week. I'll call you." She put the phone face down on the table and went back to the document. At 3 o'clock, she went to pick up Lila. Lila came out of the school door behind a girl with orange sneakers, and the two of them were arguing with great animation about something that became clear as they got closer, whether the lunch in the cafeteria had been meatloaf or meatballs, a distinction that apparently carried significant moral weight. "It was meatloaf," Lila said with some heat. "Meatballs are round." "These were kind of round," the girl said. "They were definitely not round." The girl seemed to seriously consider the counter-argument. "Fair point," she said finally, with a gravity that made Vivian want to laugh. Lila saw her mother and came over, and the other girl waved and headed toward a waiting van. "Who was that?" Vivian asked. "Sophia," Lila said. "She has the wrong opinion about meatballs." "But you talked to her." "Obviously. Someone had to correct her." Vivian walked beside her daughter back toward Aldrich Street, and the afternoon was cool and clear and smelled of cut grass from somewhere behind the school fence, and she thought, here. Whatever is next, whatever the legal filings and the counter filings and the complicated months ahead, here was something intact. Here was something she had not needed to arrange or manage or negotiate into being. Lila, with her too large backpack and her meatloaf convictions, walking home through clear afternoon air. She held on to that. They walked the 4 blocks home without talking much, which was its own kind of conversation. And when they got to the house, Lila went upstairs to study, and Vivian went back to the kitchen table and the document on her laptop screen, and the sun moved west across the narrow windows, and she kept working, careful and methodical and completely unseen, exactly as she had always been. Except that this time, she was the one deciding what it was for. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the party. Vivian was at the kitchen table on Aldrich Street when Diana called to tell her they were coming. She had 20 minutes of warning, which was enough time to finish her coffee and not enough time to feel anything particular about it. The courier was a young man in a gray jacket who handed her the envelope with the practiced neutrality of someone who delivers difficult things for a living and has learned to make his face a wall. She signed for it. She set it on the table next to her laptop. She looked at it for a moment, the thick cream envelope with the law firm's return address in the upper left corner, Hale, Drummond and Associates, embossed in navy. And then she opened it. The papers were 43 pages. She had expected fewer. She read through them the way she read financial documents, front to back, methodical, noting what she was being asked to agree to before she let herself react to any of it. Adrian was petitioning for dissolution of the marriage on grounds of irreconcilable differences, which was standard. The financial settlement proposed was not standard. It was aggressive in a way that told her someone had done homework on what they thought she could be convinced to accept. The proposal assigned her a monthly support figure that sounded reasonable until you understood what she had actually contributed to the estate's operation. The list of marital assets was constructed with visible care. Certain properties and accounts appeared, and others did not. The omissions were not accidental. She got to page 31 before she found the piece that made her set the document down. Adrian was petitioning for primary residential custody of Lila. She sat with that for a moment. Outside on Aldrich Street, a truck was backing up somewhere, the persistent beeping of its reverse alarm marking time. She could hear Lila upstairs, the particular rhythm of her daughter's footsteps crossing the floor of her room, that distinctive pattern Vivian had learned the way you learn a song you didn't mean to memorize. She picked up her phone and called Diana. "I saw it," Diana said before Vivian could speak. "He's filing for primary custody." "I know." "He hasn't attended one of her school events in 2 years. He doesn't know the name of her teacher. He called her pediatrician." Vivian stopped. She was working to keep her voice even, and it was requiring more effort than she expected. "He called her pediatrician once in 4 years, and he got the woman's name wrong." "I know," Diana said again. "This is not about Lila." Vivian had already understood that. It landed differently to hear it confirmed. "It's leverage," she said. "It's leverage. They're betting that the threat of a custody fight will push you toward the settlement they want. If they get you worried about Lila, they think you'll sign without examining the asset list too closely." Vivian looked at the 43 pages spread on her kitchen table. She thought about the shell companies. She thought about the foundation accounts. She thought about the 4 years of parallel records in their organized folders. "That was a miscalculation," she said. Diana was quiet for a beat. "Yes," she said, "it was." The second thing that happened in the weeks following the party, the thing that Adrian's legal team had not anticipated because they had never had reason to think carefully about what Vivian Sterling actually knew or what she had actually been doing for 8 years, was that the Blackwood estate began to experience operational difficulties. It started small. A vendor that supplied the estate's main property management system called about a renewal that had lapsed. The contract, it turned out, had always been managed by Vivian, and no one in the estate's current administrative structure had a record of it. The automatic payment had been tied to an account that Vivian had restructured through the estate's billing system, and that restructuring lived in documentation that only she fully understood. The vendor gave them a week before they suspended access. Then the estate's charitable foundation, which had 3 active grant cycles in progress, and a board meeting scheduled for the following month discovered that the operational files for all 3 grant cycles were organized in a system that the current administrative staff could navigate on the surface but could not actually interpret at the level required to continue the work. The filing taxonomy was Vivian's. It had grown organically over 4 years, cross-referencing data points that no one else had thought to connect. The staff could see the folders. They could not read the map. Prescott Hale called Diana directly on a Thursday afternoon and asked, without quite asking, whether Vivian might be available to assist with a transition process. Diana relayed this message to Vivian with a tone that suggested she found it interesting. "He wants me to help them understand the systems I built," Vivian said. "That's the gist of it. While simultaneously petitioning for me to lose custody of my daughter." "He's a pragmatist," Diana said. "The custody filing and the transition assistance exist in different compartments for him." Vivian was quiet for a moment. She was standing at her kitchen window watching a crow on the strip of lawn investigate something with the focused deliberation of an animal that takes its work seriously. "Tell him no," she said. "Tell him I'm happy to provide whatever documentation is required in the context of the divorce proceedings. Tell him anything beyond that is a conversation for after the custody matter is resolved." "That's going to annoy him." "I know." She watched the crow find whatever it was looking for, a bit of something hard to see from the window, and carry it off into the oak tree at the yard's edge. "Diana," she said, "how long until the custody hearing?" "If they push it through quickly, 8 weeks, maybe 10. "And the financial discovery process. When do they have to disclose the full asset list?" 30 days from the petition filing date, which is a pause, papers being moved. "In about 3 weeks. Vivian thought about the shell companies. She thought about the 3 properties that hadn't appeared in Adrian's financial disclosures. She thought about the foundation disbursements that had gone to private accounts. "When they file the discovery documents," she said, "I want us ready." "Ready how?" "Ready to show them what's missing." There was a pause on Diana's end that had a quality Vivian recognized. It was the pause of a person who is revising their understanding of a situation. "I'll need the 3rd folder set," Diana said. "The correspondence. I'll bring it tomorrow." What Vivian had not anticipated, what she had not let herself think about, because thinking about it required imagining that there were dimensions of this she did not fully understand, was that the financial irregularities in the Blackwood estate were not entirely Adrian's creation. She began to see this 3 weeks into her work on the document she was building. She had been treating the discrepancies as Adrian's mismanagement, willful or negligent, depending on the specific entry. But as she cross-referenced the records more carefully, a pattern emerged that was more complicated. Some of the transactions that had originated with the estate had been processed through channels that connected to entities entirely outside of Adrian's direct control. And the timing of those transactions, when she laid them against the calendar, corresponded not to the estate's internal decisions, but to decisions made by outside parties, parties with more structural power than a duke's household. She sat with this for a long time without writing anything. The implication was not subtle. Someone had been using the Blackwood estate's financial infrastructure as a conduit. Adrian had either permitted it deliberately, in which case he was more culpable than she'd understood, or he had failed to notice it, which said something different about him but was no less serious. Either way, the estate had been a vehicle for something larger than domestic financial mismanagement, and Vivian had maintained the records of it, had countersigned documents adjacent to it, had, through her meticulous record-keeping, created the most detailed available account of how it worked. She called Diana that night. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "When I started keeping the parallel records, the discrepancy log, the copies of the correspondence, did I expose myself legally?" Diana did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer of a kind. "It depends," Diana said, "on what a careful reading of those records shows about your knowledge at the time." "I noticed discrepancies," Vivian said. "I documented them. I didn't report them." "Why not?" Vivian thought about that question. She had thought about it before, in the private accounting she kept of her own choices. Because reporting them meant blowing up my marriage, my home, my daughter's stability, and the financial structure I depended on. And I wasn't sure enough of what I was seeing to be certain I wasn't wrong. Were you wrong? No, she said. But I didn't know that definitively. I suspected. So I kept records and I watched and I waited and I told myself I was being careful rather than cowardly. Diana was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, she said, what you just described is probably the most accurate and human account of why people in your position don't come forward. And legally, the fact that you documented rather than participated is meaningful. You weren't an actor. You were a witness. A witness who sat on the evidence for 4 years. A witness who built a case when she could have done nothing. Another pause. Vivian, what you're describing, the scope of what's in those records, have you thought about what happens when this material becomes visible to people other than me? She had thought about it. She had thought about it in the particular way she thought about most things, by imaging the sequence of events forward, step by step, past the point where she would prefer to stop. It's going to involve people who are going to feel very threatened, she said. Yes. And they're going to look for ways to manage me. Yes. She was at her kitchen table again, the room dark except for the lamp, the document open on her screen. The house on Aldrich Street was quiet, Lila asleep upstairs, the hedgehog nightlight doing its small work. Then we need to move before they understand what we have, she said. Moving too early means showing our hand. Moving too late means giving them time to build the narrative. She looked at the screen. What's the right window? Probably when the discovery documents come in, Diana said. When we see what they've chosen to disclose and what they've chosen to leave out. That tells us how aggressive they're planning to be. And then we respond accordingly. Okay, Vivian said. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Diana confirmed. Get some sleep. She did not get much sleep. This was not unusual. She had been a person who slept badly for most of her adult life. It was one of those private facts about her that had never made it into any version of the story anyone told about Vivian Sterling, because it was not a glamorous problem, and she had learned early not to mention it. She lay in the bed in the smaller of the 2 bedrooms on Aldrich Street, and she thought, in the way you think at 2 in the morning when the thoughts have shed their daylight politeness, about choices and about the specific gravity of the ones she'd deferred. She had known, somewhere, for a long time. She had known, and she had managed, and she had filed and organized and built systems, and kept records and raised a daughter, and attended the parties she had also planned, and she had moved through the rooms of Ashford Manor for 8 years with the floor plan of the estate's entire operation inside her head, and she had never, not once, sat down with her husband and said, I need something from you. I need to matter in this house in a way that isn't about what I can produce for it. She had not said it because she had not believed it would land. That was the honest answer, and honesty at 2 in the morning had a quality that was almost clean. Adrian was not, she thought, a man who had set out to reduce her. He was not calculating in that way. He lacked the patience for it, and, frankly, the imagination. He was a man who had married someone competent and capable, and then treated that competence the way you treat a well-functioning appliance, with reliance that never quite becomes appreciation. He had depended on her completely and seen her partially, and never once felt the contradiction, because the contradiction required a kind of attention to another person that he had simply never developed. This did not make her feel better. It didn't make her feel worse either. It just made her feel clear. She got up at 4 and made tea and sat at the kitchen table and worked until Lila came downstairs at 7 wanting cereal, and the day began again. The discovery documents arrived 22 days after the petition. Vivian was in Diana's office when they came through. She had made a habit of being in Diana's office on days when things were expected to arrive, partly because Diana had the better printer, and partly because she found that she processed difficult information better when she was not alone with it. She was not the kind of person who needed another presence to hold her hand. She was the kind of person who needed another presence to keep her from disappearing too completely into her own thinking. Diana opened the documents, and they went through them together, seated at the conference table, the afternoon light coming in from the west windows again. It did not take long to find what was missing. There, Vivian said, about 8 minutes in. She pointed to the assets section. 3 properties. 2 of them appear here under the family estate designation, but the third one, Carver Ridge, isn't listed at all. Carver Ridge, Diana repeated, writing it down. It's a commercial property, 52 acres outside the city. It's registered to a company called Meridian Holdings, which is a subsidiary of a subsidiary that traces back to the estate. Adrian's name is nowhere on the direct paperwork, but I have the chain of transactions that connects it. Vivian turned 3 pages. And here, these foundation disbursements, 6 of them from the last 2 fiscal years. They're listed under grant programs, but the amounts don't match the grant records I maintained. They're showing smaller amounts. They altered the figures. Either that or they're pulling from a different version of the records. She looked at the numbers. But I have the originals. Diana set down her pen. I want to be direct with you about something. Please. When we bring this into the proceeding, when we show what's been omitted and what's been altered, the response is not going to be quiet. The people who manage these transactions are not going to sit still while their names move toward a courtroom. I know. Some of these transactions, you told me they connect to parties outside the estate, outside Adrian's direct circle. Do you know yet how far outside? Vivian looked at the window. The west light was heavy and flat and made everything in the room look slightly unreal. I have one name, she said. One that appears in correspondence I found. A person who isn't part of the Blackwood household, who isn't Adrian's attorney or accountant, who has no stated relationship to the estate, but whose signature appears twice on transfer authorization documents. She paused. His name is Roger Calloway. Diana was very still. You know who that is, Vivian said. It was not a question. City Infrastructure Commissioner, Diana said. Has been for 11 years. He's been talked about as a candidate for state-level office. A beat. Where exactly does his signature appear? On 2 property transfer authorizations. The transfers moved parcels from a shell entity back to accounts that I can trace to a PAC that Calloway's allies run. Vivian set her hands flat on the conference table. I don't know if he knew he was signing documents that were part of a fraudulent structure. It's possible he was presented them as routine, but his signature is there and the documents are irregular and the money moved in a direction that benefited him. Diana said nothing for a long moment. The custody hearing is in 5 weeks, Vivian said. I'm not going to drop Calloway's name as a strategic move in a divorce proceeding. That's not what this is. But I need you to understand the full scope of what I have so we can make decisions together about how to proceed responsibly. Responsibly, Diana said carefully. I have a daughter, Diana. I'm not interested in blowing up a city commissioner's career to win a custody battle. I want to win the custody battle on the merits, on the fact that I have been Lila's primary parent for 8 years and Adrian's legal team is using her as a lever. She looked at the discovery document spread across the table. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't know what I know. Diana nodded slowly. We need to talk about whether there's an obligation to report. I know we do. And we need to talk about your safety. Vivian had thought about this too, in the quiet of 2 in the morning. I know, she said again. What she had not said to Diana, what she had not said to anyone, including Nell, who was the person she said the most things to, was that she had been frightened for about 10 days. Not dramatically, not in a way that felt cinematic, just a low-level, constant hum of awareness that she was now in possession of information that gave certain people reasons to be concerned about her. She had started parking differently, varied the route she walked to Lila's school, made sure that her copies of the records existed in 3 separate locations, one with Diana, one in a safety deposit box under her grandmother's name, one with a person she trusted who did not exist in the orbit of anyone connected to Ashford Manor. That person was Harrison Ford, the man who had left a voicemail after the party, the one she hadn't listened to right away. Harrison had worked with her on the Foundation's financial audit 3 years ago. He was meticulous and private and did not run in the Blackwood social circles by choice. When she'd finally called him back 2 weeks after the party, he had said simply, I saw what happened. If you need anything from someone who isn't connected to those people, call me. She had sent him a copy of the records. She had not told him what was in them. He had not asked. This was what competent people did for each other, she thought. They created infrastructure. They anticipated the need for it before the emergency materialized. It was, not coincidentally, exactly what she had spent 8 years doing. Meanwhile, the Blackwood Estate's operational difficulties were compounding. The property management issue had been resolved eventually. Adrian's team had hired a consultant to reconstruct enough of the system access to keep things running, but the solution was expensive and imprecise, and the consultant had said plainly to the estate's administrator that the original system was more sophisticated than he'd expected, and that whoever had built it had clearly been thinking several steps ahead of standard practice. The administrator had reported this to Prescott Hale. Hale had sat with it for a day and then called Diana again, and this time the conversation was less mediated. He asked directly whether Vivian might be open to a settlement renegotiation, specifically around the financial terms. Diana brought this to Vivian on a Friday afternoon. "He's blinking," Diana said. "He's not blinking," Vivian said. "He's fishing. He wants to know if I'll trade the asset dispute for something that lets them keep the custody pressure on." "That's one reading." "What's your reading?" Diana tilted her head slightly. "I think they're discovering that the estate's dependency on you is more complete than Adrian understood, and that's making Hale nervous about what happens when we start deposing people about how the financial systems worked and who had access to what." Vivian nodded. This was what she had expected. "Tell him the financial terms and the custody matter are not separable for me," she said. "I'm not trading one for the other. Both need to be addressed on their actual merits." "He's not going to like that." "He doesn't need to like it." There was a pause. Diana looked at her across the desk with an expression that was hard to read, something between professional assessment and something more personal. "Can I ask you something that isn't strictly legal?" "Yes." "How are you doing?" "Not tactically. Just, how are you?" Vivian thought about the question. She thought about the 2 a.m. ceiling and the tea she made at 4 and the crow in the oak tree, and Lila explaining with great authority that meatballs were round. She thought about the low hum of fear she was carrying and the way it sat alongside a feeling that was almost its opposite, a clarity, a sense of being entirely and for the first time aligned with her own purposes. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm scared in this background way that I don't let myself look at directly very often, and I feel more like myself than I have in probably 4 years." Diana seemed to accept this as a complete and honest answer. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Vivian agreed. 3 days before the custody hearing, Adrian called her directly. This had not happened before. All communication since the party had been channeled through their attorneys, a courtesy structure that both sides had maintained without it being formally agreed upon. When his name appeared on her phone screen on a Wednesday evening, she stood with it in her hand for 2 full rings before answering. "Vivian." His voice was the same as it had always been, a certain quality of ease, of assumption that she had spent a long time mistaking for confidence. "I need to talk to you." "You have an attorney for that." "I'm not calling as—" He stopped. She could hear him shifting, reorganizing the sentence. "I'm calling as Lila's father." She waited. "I don't want to do the custody hearing," he said. "That's an interesting thing to say, given that you filed for it." "Hale recommended it. Another stop. "I'm not sure I thought it through." Vivian sat down on the edge of her couch. She was careful with the anger she felt, not suppressing it, just not letting it run the conversation. "What are you asking me, Adrian? Can we find some arrangement that doesn't put Lila in the middle of this?" She looked at the lamp on the side table, its warm circle of light on the floor. "Lila is in the middle of this because you filed a custody petition using her as leverage in a financial dispute. I didn't put her there." A silence. "I know," he said. And the thing that surprised her, the thing she hadn't expected, was that it sounded, for the first time in this entire sequence of events, like something he actually meant. "I know," he said again, more quietly. She thought about what to say. She thought about the 43 pages on her kitchen table, and the 3 weeks of parallel records, and the children at the school gate, and the hedgehog nightlight, and 8 years of invisible work inside a house where she had eventually stopped waiting to be seen. "If you want to withdraw the custody petition," she said, "have Hale call Diana. We can work toward a parenting arrangement that is actually about Lila rather than about the financial settlement. But Adrian, if you file that petition again in any form, at any stage of this process, I will defend it with everything I have. And I have a great deal." Another silence. Longer. "I know you do," he said. It came out flat, without resentment, which was somehow more significant than if there had been anger in it. "Good," she said. She ended the call and sat for a moment in the lamplight. Then she got up, went to the bottom of the stairs, and called up to Lila that it was almost time for bed. "I know," came back, indignant and immediate. "Just checking," Vivian said. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened to the sound of Lila moving around in her room, the thump of the closet, the small debate she was clearly having with herself about something, the particular creak of the floorboard near the window that Vivian had already learned, already added to the inventory of this smaller house. She thought, "I am building a new map of this house, of this life, of the specific shapes of what belongs to me." It was slower work than she expected. It was also, for the first time in a long time, entirely her own. Prescott Hale withdrew the custody petition on a Monday morning. Diana called Vivian at 8:47 to tell her, and Vivian was standing in the kitchen on Aldrich Street making Lila's lunch, a turkey sandwich with the crust cut off, because Lila had strong opinions about crusts, and Vivian had decided, consciously and without guilt, that this was not a battle worth having, and she set down the knife and stood very still for a moment. "He filed the withdrawal this morning," Diana said. "No conditions attached." "Did Hale say anything to you when he filed it?" "He said his client had reconsidered the approach." "That's the exact phrasing, reconsidered the approach." Vivian looked at the sandwich on the cutting board. "What does that mean for the financial proceedings?" "It means we go to mediation on the asset dispute without the custody fight running parallel, which gives us more leverage, not less. They were using the custody petition to create pressure. Without it, we're just two parties negotiating a property settlement, and we have better documentation than they do." "When is mediation scheduled?" 3 weeks. Judge Carla Whitmore is assigned. She's thorough and she doesn't like asset concealment. I've been in front of her twice. She asks the right questions." Vivian picked up the knife and finished cutting the sandwich. She put it in the container, snapped the lid, and added it to Lila's lunchbox beside the apple slices and the 2 crackers her daughter would probably trade to Sophia for something involving chocolate. "Diana," she said, "I need to talk to you about Callaway." A pause. "How soon?" "This week. There are things I've been looking at that I don't think I can sit on much longer." "Come Thursday," Diana said. "I'll clear the afternoon." She put Lila's lunchbox in her backpack and went to the bottom of the stairs and called up that it was time, and Lila came down in mismatched socks, one striped, one solid, a combination that she defended as intentional, and they walked the 4 blocks to Meridian Elementary in the thin October light, and Vivian listened to her daughter explain that Sophia had a new theory about the cafeteria's food procurement process that was, in Lila's assessment, probably wrong, but interestingly wrong. "Interestingly wrong is worth something," Vivian said. "That's what I told her." She watched Lila go through the gate and stood on the sidewalk for a moment after her daughter disappeared through the school's front door. A woman about Vivian's age was standing nearby doing the same thing, watching the door after her child had vanished through it, with the particular expression of a person who has just handed something precious off into the world's custody for another day. The woman caught Vivian's eye and gave a small nod that communicated everything. "I know, same." Vivian nodded back and walked home. The thing about Roger Callaway's name in those documents was that it had not gotten less significant the more she looked at it. She had spent 3 weeks hoping, in the part of herself that would have preferred a smaller problem, that further examination would reveal an innocent explanation, a miscommunication, a clerical misattribution. She had looked at the documents from every angle she knew how to approach them. She kept arriving at the same place. His signature appeared on 2 property transfer authorizations dated 14 months apart. The first transferred the commercial parcel from a shell entity, Ridgeline Development Partners, LLC, to an account she had traced through 3 intermediary steps to a political action committee associated with Callaway's network of allies. The second authorization moved a different parcel in the opposite direction, but through the same shell entity, which by that point had absorbed enough of the first transaction's value that the second move effectively laundered the benefit into a different form. She had not been looking for this. That was the thing she returned to most often. She had been keeping records of the estate's financial operations out of professional habit and personal self-preservation, And she had found this the way you find a stain on a wall when you're painting a different room, not because you were looking, but because you were thorough. On Thursday, she spread everything across Diana's conference table. Diana went through it slowly. She was a person who read carefully and reacted minimally while reading, and Vivian had learned to let her finish before speaking. She sat at the far end of the table with a cup of coffee she was letting go cold, and she waited. After 25 minutes, Diana set down the last page. "You've had this for how long?" "The full picture, assembled, about 6 weeks. Individual pieces, longer." "And you haven't shown this to anyone except me and Harrison Ford?" "Correct." Diana was quiet for a moment, turning a pen end over end on the table, a habit Vivian had noticed she had when she was thinking through something she didn't want to get wrong. "This isn't a divorce proceeding anymore," she said. "I know. This is a referral to the city prosecutor's office, possibly to the state attorney general, depending on the scope of the PAC involvement." She set the pen flat. "And if we make that referral, you become a material witness in a public corruption investigation, with a name attached to it who has 11 years of political infrastructure in this city." Vivian looked at the papers. "I understand that. It's going to get complicated for you, Vivian, personally, professionally. Callaway has allies, and those allies will feel threatened, and people who feel threatened look for ways to redirect attention. They'll say I fabricated the records. They'll say a lot of things. They'll question your motives. They'll connect your involvement to the divorce and argue that you're weaponizing this material." Diana looked at her directly. "Are you prepared for that?" Vivian thought about the question honestly, the way she tried to think about difficult questions, not to find the answer that made her feel better, but the one that was most accurate. "I don't know," she said. "I've thought about it a lot, and I keep arriving at the same thing, which is that I have this information, and sitting on it because it's inconvenient for me is a choice with consequences too. Not legal consequences, maybe, but other kinds." "What kind?" "The kind where I know what I know and I did nothing with it." She paused. "I spent 8 years doing nothing with things I noticed, making myself smaller because the alternative was too disruptive. I don't want to do that anymore." Diana was quiet for a long moment. Then, "All right, there's a way to do this that protects you legally and gives the information a proper channel. I know someone at the State Attorney General's office. Nadia Reeves. She runs the Public Integrity Unit. She's serious, and she's not political in the way Callaway's allies are political. I can arrange a meeting." "Would that affect the divorce proceedings?" "It could. If the criminal investigation moves forward and Adrian is implicated, it complicates the asset division because those assets may become subject to forfeiture proceedings. But it could also clarify the picture in ways that benefit you. A court isn't going to dismiss what's in those documents just because they're also relevant to another proceeding." "When can you get me in front of Nadia Reeves?" "Let me call her today." The meeting with Nadia Reeves happened 4 days later in an office building 2 blocks from the state courthouse. The building was unremarkable. Deliberately so, Vivian suspected, the kind of institutional beige that doesn't invite attention. Reeves herself was compact and direct, somewhere in her mid-40s, with the particular quality of someone who had long ago stopped needing external validation for her own assessments. She shook Vivian's hand without preamble and gestured at the chairs across from her desk. Diana sat beside Vivian. Reeves had a legal pad and a coffee mug that said Cleveland, Ohio on the side in faded letters, which seemed like an artifact of a previous life. "Tell me what you have," Reeves said. Vivian told her. She had done this enough now, with Diana, with herself at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, that the account came out clean and in order. She did not editorialize. She did not interpret. She laid out what the document showed and what she had observed and what the cross-references revealed, and she did it with the same precision she had brought to 8 years of financial management. When she finished, Reeves looked at Diana. "She's been this organized the whole time?" "The whole time," Diana confirmed. Reeves turned back to Vivian. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly rather than strategically." "All right. Did you know what you had when you started keeping these records?" Vivian considered this. "I knew the estate's accounts had irregularities. I documented them because I'm the kind of person who documents things. I did not know, not for a long time, that the irregularities connected to anything outside the household. When I started to see that pattern, I kept going because I had enough training to understand what I was looking at. And the Calloway connection. That came later. Maybe a year before the party. I sat on it because I didn't know what to do with it, and I was still inside a marriage that would have been difficult to navigate if I had surfaced it. You sat on potential evidence of public corruption for a year. Yes, Vivian said. She did not look away. I did. Reeves studied her for a moment. Thank you for not making an excuse for that. I'm not here to manage your perception of me. I'm here because I have information that matters, and I need to give it to the right person. Something shifted slightly in Reeves's expression, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to respect. She picked up her pen. Leave me the documents. Diana keeps copies. We don't discuss this with anyone outside this room until I've had my team look at it. If we move forward with an investigation, you'll be contacted through Diana and there will be a formal witness protection protocol. Nothing dramatic, but certain precautions. I've already taken some precautions, Vivian said. Reeves glanced up. What kind? Varied my routine. Multiple copies of the records in separate locations under different names. A person outside the Blackwood network who holds a set of originals. She paused. I read enough to know what happens when people with this kind of information don't think ahead. Reeves set the pen down. Who told you to do that? Nobody. I figured it out. Reeves and Diana exchanged a brief look that Vivian caught and could not fully interpret. All right, Reeves said. Give me 2 weeks. And Miss Sterling, don't tell anyone about this conversation. Not your grandmother, not your friend Margot, not anyone. I understand. This is the part where people usually ask me if they're safe. Vivian looked at her steadily. Am I? Reeves seemed to consider the honest answer. You're safer having told me than not telling me. I'm not going to promise more than that. That's enough, Vivian said. The mediation over the asset settlement was scheduled to begin the following week. Vivian had not told Diana to slow it down. She needed the divorce finalized, needed the financial clarity, needed the legal structure of her life to stop being in suspension. She and Diana prepared for the mediation session, the way you prepare for something where the other side knows less about their own situation than you do. Carefully, without overplaying, letting the documentation speak before adding interpretation. The mediator was a man named Gerald Cutts, 60 years old, a former family court judge with a reputation for patience and an allergy to posturing. He ran his sessions from a conference room in his own building, neutral ground, deliberately ordinary, a place where the absence of grandeur was itself a message about how things were expected to proceed. Adrian arrived with Hale and a junior attorney. Vivian hadn't met. Adrian was wearing a suit she recognized, charcoal wool, bought 3 years ago for a foundation gala, one she'd selected because he had no patience for shopping and she'd been trying to solve the problem efficiently. He looked tired. Not apologetic, not diminished, just tired, in the way of someone who has recently discovered that several things they assumed were solid were not. He did not quite meet her eyes when they entered the room. He looked in her direction and then looked at something slightly adjacent to her face, which she recognized as a technique, whether learned or instinctive, for managing a situation you hadn't yet figured out how to inhabit. Gerald Cutts introduced himself to the room, unnecessary but procedurally grounding, and they sat. The first 2 hours were what Diana had prepared her for, a structured exchange of positions, Hale presenting the estate's asset picture in terms that were technically accurate but artfully curated, Diana presenting Vivian's counter-assessment with citations to specific documents. Cutts asked questions with the precision of someone who had spent 3 decades watching people try to obscure things in conference rooms and had grown very good at noticing the gaps. At the break, Vivian went to the water table at the edge of the room. Adrian came up beside her. She did not move away. This is going to take a while, he said. It was not a complaint. It was just an observation. Yes, she said. He poured himself a glass of water. He turned the glass in his hand. Hale told me you turned down the transition assistance request. I did. I would have... He stopped. I would have wanted you to help, even now. That's not me trying to get something. It's me saying that I'm realizing how much was held together by things I didn't understand. She looked at him. He was 50 years old, and the lines around his eyes were deeper than they had been 8 years ago, and there was something in his face that was unfamiliar, a kind of reckoning that she had never seen there before. She didn't trust it completely. She wasn't sure she was supposed to. "Adrian," she said, "you had 8 years to notice. You didn't. I know. I'm not saying that to punish you. I'm saying it because the reason you didn't notice was that you never really looked. And I could have made more noise about it. I didn't, for my own reasons. We both made choices that got us here." She set down her water glass. "What I need from you now is for the financial settlement to reflect what I actually contributed, not what your legal team thinks I can be convinced to accept." He was quiet for a moment. "What do the records show?" She held his gaze. "That you would not have a functioning estate, an operational foundation, or an accurate accounting of your own assets without 8 years of my work." She said it without heat. "The records show that." He didn't argue. That surprised her, not because she'd expected him to lie, exactly, but because acknowledgement from Adrian had always come slowly and partially, like light through a door opened only an inch. This felt different, more complete. "Tell Hale to stop protecting the Carver Ridge property," she said quietly. "It's going to come up regardless. How it comes up is the only question." Something moved across his face, a recognition, then something else that she couldn't classify. "You know about Carver Ridge." "I know about several things," she said. "I'm not trying to use them against you. But you should talk to Hale about what the full discovery process is going to look like. And you should tell him the truth about what's in those accounts." Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Vivian, is there something I should be worried about beyond the divorce?" She looked back at him with the particular expression of someone who is choosing words carefully, not from evasiveness, but from precision. "Talk to Hale," she said, "today. Tell him everything about Callaway and Ridgeline. Everything." She picked up her water glass and walked back to her seat. The mediation continued through the afternoon, and by 4 o'clock, Gerald Cutts had identified 12 areas of specific disagreement that would need to be resolved either in subsequent sessions or through the court process. He outlined a timeline, optimistically, he said, 6 weeks, and he adjourned without editorial comment, which was his style. In the hallway afterward, Hale came to Diana's side while Adrian stood slightly apart, looking at his phone without appearing to see it. Hale spoke quietly. "Miss Marsh, my client would like to revisit the Carver Ridge valuation." Diana's expression did not change. "Ms. Sterling's position is that all relevant assets need to be accurately disclosed, including Carver Ridge's connection to Meridian Holdings and the complete chain of entities." Hale received this without visible reaction, which was his professional skill. "I'll need to consult with my client." "Of course," Diana said. In the elevator down to the lobby, once the doors had closed and they were alone, Diana turned to Vivian and said, "What did you say to him at the water table?" "I told him to tell his attorney the truth." "And?" "I mentioned Callaway's name." Diana looked at the elevator doors. That was a risk. It was a calculated one. Adrian is many things, but he's not. He didn't originate whatever Callaway was doing. He was used, and he doesn't fully know it yet. If he walks into whatever is coming without understanding the landscape, he's going to respond badly and make everything messier. And if he panics and calls Callaway directly? Vivian had thought about this. Callaway already knows something is moving. His people will have picked up on the investigation through channels I can't track. Adrian calling him doesn't materially change Callaway's position, but it might change Adrian's. It might make him understand who he's been dealing with. Diana considered this. The elevator opened to the lobby. They walked out into the late afternoon, the October air sharper now, the daylight going earlier. "You're playing a longer game than I initially understood," Diana said. "I'm not playing anything," Vivian said. "I just know how these things connect." The call from Nadia Reeves came 11 days later. Diana relayed it. The Attorney General's office was opening a formal inquiry into the Ridgeline transactions and their connection to Callaway's political network. The inquiry was not yet public. It would remain sealed until the investigators had completed their initial phase. Vivian would be contacted when her formal witness statement was required. In the same week, a reporter named Stephen Mauger from the city's main investigative outlet left Diana a message asking to speak with Vivian Sterling about her divorce proceedings and their connection to the Blackwood Estate's financial operations. "He knows something," Diana said. "How much?" "Enough to be asking the right questions. Not enough to publish yet." But Vivian thought about this. She thought about Nadia Reeves's instruction. Don't discuss this with anyone. She thought about what a story in the press would do to the investigation, to Lila's school situation, to the things she and Diana were trying to build carefully in the mediation process. "Tell him no comment for now," she said. "But, Diana, keep the line open with him. Don't close it. When the time comes to say something, I want to have a relationship with a reporter who does this work seriously." "You're thinking ahead." "Always," Vivian said. The thing that happened next was not something she had planned for, which was perhaps why it hit her differently than the things she had prepared for. Margot called on a Sunday evening. Vivian answered because it had been almost 3 weeks since she'd told Margot to give her time, and 3 weeks was more than enough time. "I need to tell you something," Margot said. She had the voice of someone who has been rehearsing an opening and still hasn't found the right one. "I know you're in the middle of everything, and I know this isn't... It's just... I heard something at the Whitmore benefit last Thursday." "What did you hear?" "It came from someone in Calloway's circle. I didn't talk to him directly. I overheard. Vivian, they're saying that your records are falsified, that you altered the foundation documents as part of the divorce strategy, and that you're planning to use them to threaten certain people." A pause. "They're building a story. About you. Before you can build one about them." Vivian sat down slowly on the edge of her couch. "Who specifically was saying this?" "A man named Denton. He works for Calloway's PAC. I've seen him at events, but I don't know him well. He was talking to 2 other men, and I was on the other side of a pillar, and they didn't see me." "Did he use my name?" "Yes." Vivian was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the side table cast its familiar circle of warm light on the floor. From upstairs, she could hear Lila watching something on her tablet, the thin sound of cartoon voices filtering down through the ceiling. "Margot," she said, "can you write down exactly what you heard, as much as you remember, as precisely as possible, word for word where you can? You want me to—" "Yes, I can do that. Email it to Diana tonight if you're able. Copy no one else." "Vivian?" A pause. "Are you okay? Actually okay?" She looked at the lamplight on the floor. She thought about the answer. "They're doing what I expected them to do," she said. "They're trying to get in front of it, which means they're worried." She let that settle. "I'm okay. Really." She called Diana the moment she hung up from Margot. "They're going to try to preempt," Vivian said, and described what Margot had heard. "Denton," Diana said. "Kenneth Denton. He's Calloway's political director. He doesn't freelance. If he's saying this at a public event, it's a coordinated message. They're testing whether the narrative will take hold." "Can we respond?" "Not yet. Responding now legitimizes their framing. We need to let Reeves know immediately. This kind of narrative seeding before a public corruption inquiry goes public is something her office is going to want documented." "All right. Vivian, this is escalating." "I know. I want to say something, and I need you to hear it as legal advice, not as—" Diana paused, choosing, "as someone being dramatic." "Say it." "Mo, your personal security needs to be more formal than varied routes and safety deposit boxes. I know someone, private security, discreet, former federal background. I want you to at least have a conversation with them." Vivian thought about Lila's school route, the 4 blocks, the morning walk with the travel mug. "Set it up," she said. She didn't sleep well that night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than the 2 in the morning grief of the weeks after the party. That had been the sleeplessness of loss. This was something else, a vigilance, a mind that refused to go quiet because there was too much that needed watching. She lay in the dark and she went through the documentation in her head, the chain of transactions, the shell entities, the authorization signatures, the correspondence that connected the dots. She was good at holding complex structures in her mind. It was, perhaps, the skill she'd developed most completely in 8 years of managing a complicated household alongside a complicated business. She could see the whole map. The question was not whether the evidence was strong. It was. The question was whether the people who would be damaged by it had the reach to make her version of events irrelevant before it could get to the right room. She had thought about that question for 3 weeks, and she kept arriving at the same place. The only protection was transparency, and the only way to transparency was through channels she had already set in motion. Reeves had the documents. Diana had the strategy. Harrison Ford had the originals in a location that had nothing to do with Vivian's name. She had done what she could do. Whatever came next would come. She turned on her side and looked at the window. The curtain moved slightly in the draft. The house on Aldrich Street was old enough to breathe, to let the autumn in through its margins. She listened to the sound of it. In the morning, she would take Lila to school. She would walk the 4 blocks and hand her daughter off at the gate and stand on the sidewalk for the moment after, watching the door close. She would walk home and sit at the kitchen table with the narrow counter space and the yard with ambitions, and she would work, carefully and methodically, and without anyone to see her do it. She had done that for 8 years inside someone else's house. She could do it now from her own. The custody hearing, withdrawn but not forgotten, not structurally resolved, still sat in the back of every conversation with Diana like a piece of furniture. You have to walk around in a room that's slightly too small. Adrian had withdrawn the petition. That was not the same as Adrian being, in the eyes of the court, a reconstructed presence in his daughter's life. If the proceeding moved toward any kind of formal parenting order, Vivian would need to establish on the record what Lila's actual experience of each parent had been. She had thought about this carefully. She asked Lila's teacher at Meridian, a patient woman named Ms. Okafor, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and seemed constitutionally incapable of speaking about children without genuine warmth, whether she would be willing to document her observations about Lila's transition to the new school. Not for formal testimony, just a written account of what she'd seen. Ms. Okafor said yes without hesitation. "She's an exceptional little person," she said. "Very precise, very loyal." A pause. "She's also carrying something. I see it sometimes when she thinks no one is watching, but she handles it the way some kids handle things, by holding it together until she has a quiet moment and then letting it breathe." Vivian stood in the hallway outside the classroom door and felt the specific pain of a parent being told the truth about their child. "That's accurate," she said. "She's going to be fine," Ms. Okafor said. "I mean that carefully, not as a platitude. She has the kind of internal structure that—" She seemed to search for words. She got that from somewhere. It doesn't come from nothing. Vivian looked at the classroom door, the small rectangle of window in it, the rows of small desks visible through the glass. "Thank you," she said. She meant it for more than one thing. The formal custody arrangement was negotiated, not in a courtroom in the end, but in a second round of mediation that happened quietly, 3 weeks after the first session on the financial settlement. Diana and Hale presented a parenting framework that Gerald Cutts described, with characteristic understatement, as workable. Lila would live primarily with Vivian. Adrian would have structured time, every other weekend, one evening during the school week, with a review clause built in for the following year. It was not an order that praised Adrian. It was an order that reflected what the record showed, that Vivian had been the daily parent for 8 years, and Lila's stability was built in that direction, and courts did not reorganize children's lives for the sake of theoretical equity. When the order was formalized, Vivian sat in Diana's office and read it twice. Then she put it in the folder with the other documents she was keeping, and she said, "Okay." And Diana said, "Okay." And that was the whole of the exchange. That evening, she told Lila that her dad was going to start having regular visits, that he would see her every other weekend and one weeknight, and that this was a good thing even if it also meant some adjustments. Lila was at the kitchen table doing homework. She had a pencil tucked behind her ear that she kept forgetting was there and then rediscovering with mild surprise. She listened to Vivian and was quiet for a moment. "Every other weekend is a lot," she said. "It is." "Does he want to, or is it a rule thing?" Vivian looked at her daughter, 8 years old, pencil behind her ear, asking the question that cut directly to the thing adults spent enormous energy avoiding. "He wants to," Vivian said. He hasn't always known how to show that well, but I think he's trying to do better. Lila considered this with characteristic seriousness. How do you know if trying to do better is actually doing better, or just saying it? You watch, Vivian said. Over time, actions build up or they don't, and eventually you can tell. Lila nodded slowly. She reached up, found the pencil behind her ear, looked at it as if it had appeared there by magic, and put it back down on the table. Okay, she said. Then, can we have soup tonight? The kind with the noodles? We can have that, Vivian said. She stood up and went to the cabinet for the pot, and the kitchen was warm, and the lamplight was the same circle on the floor it always was, and outside on Aldrich Street the October night was settling in around the house, and she put water on to boil and kept going. The Attorney General's inquiry went public on a Wednesday in early November, 6 weeks after Vivian had sat across from Nadia Reeves and spread her documents across a desk in an unremarkable building 2 blocks from the courthouse. She found out the way most people found out, through her phone, a news alert at 6:41 in the morning while she was still in the kitchen waiting for coffee to brew. The headline was measured, the kind of careful language that investigative outlets use when they have confirmed facts, but are still mapping the edges. State AG opens inquiry into Infrastructure Commissioner Callaway over alleged property diversion scheme. The article named Ridgeline Development Partners. It named 2 of the shell entities. It did not name Vivian. She read it twice, standing at the counter in her robe, the coffee maker finishing its cycle behind her. Then she called Diana. I saw it, Diana said. How much did they use? The broad structure, not the specifics of the document chain. That's still sealed as part of the investigation. What's in the article is consistent with what you gave Reeves, but it's been independently developed. Her office isn't pulling from a single source, which means they found their own corroboration. Which means your material was the map, and they built the case from there. A pause. Vivian, your name is going to come up. Not today, probably, but as this develops, reporters are going to trace the financial records back to who maintained them, and the answer is you. She had known this. She had known it the way you know things you have decided to proceed in spite of. Okay, she said. Stephen Mauger from the City Outlet, the reporter I've been keeping the line open with, he called me last night, before the story broke. He's ahead of it. What does he know? He knows that the Blackwood Estates accounts were at the center of the transaction chain. He knows that the primary financial administrator of those accounts was not Adrian, but his wife. He doesn't yet know what Vivian Sterling looks like up close. She looked out the kitchen window at the yard. November had taken the last of the leaves. The oak tree at the yard's edge was bare now, its branches against the gray morning sky like something drawn with a thin pen. When can I meet with him? She said. Diana paused. You want to talk to him? I want to talk to him before he writes the version of me that someone else hands him. She set her coffee mug on the counter. Can you arrange it? I can, but Vivian, Reeves needs to know you're talking to a reporter. She'll want to approve the parameters. Call her first, then Mauger. She went upstairs, got Lila up and ready for school, made 2 pieces of toast that they ate standing in the kitchen in the particular compressed efficiency of a school morning, and walked the 4 blocks to Meridian Elementary. On the walk, Lila told her about a project on regional geography that Ms. Okafor had assigned, which Lila had decided to approach as a question of why people settled where they did, rather than simply cataloging the settlements. Most of it is water, Lila said. People settle where there's water. That's right. But then some of it's like power. Somebody was already there, or somebody wanted to control the route. She had the pencil behind her ear again, which she'd apparently taken to carrying as a general practice. So the maps look like geography, but they're actually about what people wanted. Vivian looked at her daughter, Tinya, 8 years old with a pencil behind her ear, explaining political economy on the walk to school. That's a very good framework, she said. Ms. Okafor said it was sophisticated. Ms. Okafor is right. At the gate, Lila went through without ceremony. The brief adaptation period was clearly over. The school now simply a place she belonged, which was what Vivian had needed to see happen more than almost anything else in the past 2 months. She watched her daughter disappear through the door and stood on the sidewalk in the thin November light. The security consultant Diana had connected her with, A man named Paul Garrett, former federal, precise, and unobtrusive in his manner, had walked the route from the house to the school twice. He had made 3 recommendations, which Vivian had implemented, none of which changed the fundamental texture of the morning in ways she couldn't live with. She was aware of him now in the way you become aware of a precaution you've internalized, present without being central. She walked home and sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop, and the news alert was still there at the top of her screen, and she read the article a 3rd time. The name Roger Calloway appeared 14 times. She closed the laptop and got back to work. The financial settlement mediation had its 3rd and final session on a Thursday, 8 days after the Attorney General's announcement. The atmosphere in Gerald Kutz's conference room was different from the first session, not dramatically, but perceptibly, in the way that rooms change when the people in them have been altered by events outside the room. Hale was more careful than he'd been in October. Adrian was quieter. The junior attorney who had come to the first session was not present. The Carver Ridge property was on the table. Hale had clearly prepared for this with some difficulty. He presented a valuation that was more complete than the one in the original discovery documents. Carver Ridge now appeared in full, its connection to Meridian Holdings acknowledged, its value assessed at a figure that Vivian's independent valuation put roughly 20% lower than its actual market position. Not dramatically undervalued. Enough to matter over time. Diana raised the discrepancy without theatrics. She placed Vivian's independent valuation on the table beside Hale's and let Cutts look at both. Cutts studied them for a moment. "The gap here is significant," he said. "Mr. Hale, can you account for the differential?" "The valuation methodology," Hale began, "is based on which comparables?" Cutts asked. He had the manner of someone who has heard every version of this explanation and finds them all less interesting than the underlying fact. Hale named the comparable properties. Diana noted, without inflection, that 2 of them were pre-development parcels in different zoning categories, which was a comparison that skewed the Carver Ridge assessment downward in ways that were technically defensible and practically misleading. Cutts looked at the documents. Then he looked at Hale. "I'd like a revised valuation from your team using comparables in the same zoning classification by next Wednesday." It was the kind of direction that signals, without stating, that a mediator has formed a view. At the water table during the break, Adrian came to stand beside her again. This was becoming, Vivian realized, a pattern. The formal session as one conversation, Adrian at the water table as a different one, quieter, less managed. "The Calloway story," he said. He kept his voice low, looking at the table rather than at her. "Yes. Hale told me that investigators have been talking to people in the estate's former vendor network." He poured water, not drinking it, about transactions that went through our accounts. "I know," she said. "Did you—" He stopped, reframed. "When you told me to talk to Hale about Calloway, you knew what was coming." She looked at him steadily. "I knew what was already in motion." "How long?" "I met with the State Attorney General's office in October." He was quiet for a long moment. The water glass in his hand caught the overhead light. "I didn't know what Calloway was doing," he said. "Not the full picture. I knew some of the transactions weren't. I thought it was creative accounting, things that would straighten out." He stopped again. "That's not a defense. I know it's not. I want you to know that I wasn't orchestrating it." Vivian looked at his face. She was reasonably good at reading Adrian Blackwood by now. She had had 8 years of practice, and what she saw was not performance. It was the specific exhaustion of a man who has been shown a structure he thought he understood and is learning that the structure was not what he believed. "I know you didn't orchestrate it," she said. "You were used. That's different from being innocent, but it's different from being the architect." "Will that matter? Legally?" "Talk to Hale, and talk to a criminal attorney, someone separate from Hale, someone whose only client in this is you personally." She said it as information, not as care. But it was also, she recognized, a kind of care. The residual kind that survives the end of a marriage, because the person you were married to is still the parent of your child, and their stability is not separate from your daughter's. "I already have," he said. "I made the call last week." "Good." She went back to her seat. The revised Carver Ridge valuation came in the following Wednesday, and it was closer to Vivian's figure, within 4%, which Diana assessed as acceptable. The mediation concluded that afternoon with a settlement framework that Cutts described as equitable and that Diana described, privately to Vivian in the elevator going down, as better than what she'd originally been prepared to accept. The foundation assets? Vivian asked. The 3 grant cycles in progress transfer to an independent trustee who will complete them. Vivian, you're named as a consultant to the transition. One-time, compensated. Your involvement is optional. If you want to finish what you started, you can. She thought about the grant cycles, the work she'd done on them, the small, precise machinery of getting resources to the people who needed them, the satisfaction of a well-structured disbursement. She thought about the people at the receiving end of those grants, who had nothing to do with any of this and had been waiting. I'll do the transition, she said, for the grants, not for the estate. I'll document that as a specific carve-out. The financial settlement was signed 10 days before Thanksgiving. It was not a perfect document. No settlement between 2 people with history was a perfect document, but it was accurate. The assets were fully disclosed, the valuation was honest, and what Vivian received reflected 8 years of work in terms that an outside reader could examine and find defensible. She signed it at Diana's conference table on a gray afternoon with the west windows showing a sky the color of old pewter. Diana handed her the pen. She signed where indicated. There were 14 places. And each time she set the pen to paper, she was aware of the strangeness of reducing 8 years to a series of initials. When she was done, she sat back and looked at the signed pages. How do you feel? Diana asked. Like I need lunch, Vivian said. Diana laughed, a short, genuine sound. That's the most honest post-settlement response I've heard in 20 years of practice. They went to a diner 2 blocks from the office. It was the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that came in thick ceramic mugs without asking, and Vivian ordered a club sandwich and ate most of it, and Diana ordered soup and told her 3 things about the next phase. The divorce decree would be finalized within 4 weeks. The parenting order was already in effect. Vivian's name had not yet appeared in any press coverage of the Callaway investigation. And Vivian listened and nodded and drank her coffee and felt, incrementally, the specific weight of something that had been pressing on her chest for 4 months begin to shift. Not lift. Shift. Move into a different position. The thing was not over. It would not be over for some time. The investigation would continue, the press would continue. There would be more. But the acute phase of her own situation was resolving, and the resolution felt like ground under her feet rather than like winning. There was a difference. She had thought about that difference a great deal. Adrian's first overnight with Lila happened the second weekend in November. Vivian had prepared for it by not preparing too much, by resisting the impulse to give Lila instructions, or to fill the weekend before with the kind of focused attention that communicates anxiety rather than confidence. She packed Lila's bag with Lila's input, clothes, the hedgehog nightlight, because it traveled everywhere, the paperback she was in the middle of about a girl who discovers her grandmother was a cartographer. Adrian picked Lila up on Saturday morning at 10. He arrived on time, which Vivian noted and filed without comment. He was in a different car than the one she remembered, a practical dark blue SUV rather than the controlled elegance of the vehicles that had populated life at Ashford Manor. And he was in jeans and a fleece, which was not how she had ever seen him on a weekend in 8 years of marriage. People changed their presentation when the audience changed. She understood that. Lila went to him with the measured ease of a child who is proceeding with reasonable trust and is reserving further opinion. She gave Vivian a hug at the door, the particular grip of her daughter's arms around her neck, the familiar weight of her. And then she went with her father to the SUV and got in, and Vivian stood on the front step and watched them back out of the driveway and drive down Aldrich Street until the car was gone. She stood there for a moment in the November air. Then she went inside, and the house was quiet in a way that was entirely new. Not the quiet of Ashford Manor, which had been the quiet of a large space mostly empty, nor the quiet of the first weeks on Aldrich Street, which had still been adjusting, still listening for what it was. This was the quiet of a house that knew itself now, that had a family in it who had been learning each other for 4 months, and one of whom was temporarily absent, and the absence was noted. She made herself coffee and sat at the kitchen table and did not work. She sat and looked at the yard, the bare oak, the November grass, the strip of garden bed along the fence that she had, tentatively and without confidence, planted 3 bulbs in last week on the theory that spring would eventually come, and she might as well be prepared for it. Nell called at noon. "How is it?" Nell asked. "Quiet," Vivian said. "Strange, but not bad strange." "You should come for dinner. I'm making the chicken thing." The chicken thing was a dish Nell had made since Vivian's childhood, roasted with lemon and something she refused to identify, but that Vivian had always suspected was anchovy paste. And it was the kind of food that was less about flavor than about continuity. "I'll come at 6, Vivian said. She spent the afternoon doing something she had not done in, she couldn't remember how long. She walked. Not the school route, not a purposeful errand. She went out the front door and turned north and walked without a destination through the neighborhood, through the afternoon light that was going thin and gold the way November light did, past the houses with their November yards, and the last stubborn marigolds in the window boxes, and the kids on bikes on the flat end of the street. She thought about what came next. The question of what came next had been pressing at the edge of her attention since the settlement was signed, but she had not let herself open it fully because there had always been something more immediate. The mediation, the custody arrangement, the investigation, the daily management of Lila's transition, and her own. Now the immediacy was receding, not gone, but different. Harrison Ford had called her 2 weeks earlier and asked, carefully and without pressure, whether she had given any thought to what she wanted to do professionally. He ran a small financial consulting firm, 8 people, private clients, corporate compliance work, and he was, he said, thinking about expanding into a specific area, institutional accountability, helping organizations identify and address the kind of structural financial vulnerabilities that she had spent 8 years watching from the inside of one. "I'm not asking you to commit to anything," he said. "I'm asking if you want to have lunch and talk about what that kind of work would look like." She had told him she would think about it. She was thinking about it now, walking in the November afternoon, and what she was thinking was that the work he described was work she knew how to do, had been doing, in a sense, for years without naming it, identifying the places where a system's formal accounting and its actual behavior diverged, building documentation that could bear scrutiny, understanding not just the numbers but the human decisions behind them and the human decisions those numbers enabled. She had done all of that inside a marriage, inside a household, invisible and uncompensated in any formal sense. She could do it in the world, with her name on it, for people and institutions that needed it. She turned back toward the house when the light started to go, and she had a headache from walking in the cold without a hat, which was her own fault, and her feet were slightly damp from the wet grass in the park she'd cut through near the elementary school. These were the small, imperfect realities of a life she was navigating without a net and without a plan. And she found, walking home with her headache and her damp feet, that she was not unhappy. Dinner at Nell's was the chicken thing and roasted carrots, and the bread Nell kept in the freezer for occasions, and the conversation that moved, as it always did with Nell, through things directly and without ceremony. "The settlement is done," Nell said. "Signed. And it's fair?" "It's accurate," Vivian said, which is better than fair in the end. Nell nodded, turning her fork over. She had a particular gesture when she was deciding whether to say something, a slight tipping of her head to the left, and she did it now. "Are you going to be all right financially?" "Yes. Better than I let myself expect, honestly." She looked at her plate. The estate's dependency on the work I did was, once it was laid out in discovery, it was hard to argue with. Funny how that works. 8 years of documentation, Vivian said. Turns out it was worth keeping. Nell smiled, the dry, specific smile of a 71-year-old woman who has seen a great many situations resolve in ways that retrospectively seem obvious but required real endurance to survive. "I want to say I told you so," she said, "but I don't think I ever quite told you. I just believed it." "That's enough," Vivian said. "Sometimes that's the thing." Roger Calloway resigned from his position as City Infrastructure Commissioner on a Tuesday morning in late November. The resignation letter, which was published in full by 3 local outlets, cited a desire to address personal matters and used the phrase pending matters without specifying what those matters were. It did not contain the word corruption or the word fraud, or the word ridgeline. It was the letter of a man who had been advised by very good attorneys to say as little as possible while still meeting the formal requirement of saying something. Nadia Reeves's office issued a statement the same day, confirming that the inquiry was ongoing and that additional information would be provided at the appropriate time. Stephen Mauger published a long piece that afternoon that was the most detailed account yet of the Ridgeline transaction chain. He named 3 additional shell entities that Vivian's documents had flagged. He described the authorization structure, how the signatures had been obtained and in what sequence, with an accuracy that told her his independent sourcing had found corroboration beyond what she had given Reeves. He did not name Vivian. She read the piece twice at her kitchen table and then texted Diana, "Mauger's piece. He's thorough." Diana texted back, "He's ready to talk to you when you are. Not for attribution yet, if you prefer, just on background." She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about the Denton conversation at the Whitmore benefit. Your records are falsified. She altered the foundation documents. And the narrative they had tried to seed before it could be replaced by something more accurate. She thought about the 8 years of invisible work and what it meant to keep being invisible now that the things she'd documented were changing the shape of the city. She texted Diana back, "Set it up." She met Stephen Mauger the following Thursday at a coffee shop on Remington Street. His suggestion, a place he described as having bad lighting and good coffee, which proved accurate on both counts. He was younger than she'd expected from his byline, maybe 34, with the slightly compressed alertness of someone who has trained himself to listen before talking and still finds it an effort. He did not start with the story. He started with, "What do you want me to understand before I start asking questions?" She looked at him across the small table. "That I'm not a source seeking revenge for a bad divorce. What I documented because I was in a position to see it, and I kept records because that's what I do. The divorce is its own thing. The financial irregularities are a different thing that happen to intersect with it. Can you separate them in practice?" "I can keep them straight in my own mind," she said. "Whether a reader can is your problem." He seemed to appreciate the precision. He took out a notebook, an actual paper notebook, which she found slightly anachronistic and also appropriate. "On background for now?" "On background for now." She talked to him for 2 hours. She did not give him the documents. Reeves had those. And her channel to Reeves was the right channel. But she gave him context and sequence, and she gave him the framework for understanding how the transaction structure had worked from the inside, how it had been designed to look like routine estate business unless you knew what the routing actually meant. When they were done, he looked at his notebook and then at her. "Can I ask you something off the record?" "You can ask." "Were you frightened when you were first figuring out what the record showed?" She thought about the honest answer. "Yes," she said, in a background kind of way that I tried not to look at directly for a while. The fear and the work existed at the same time. I just kept doing the work. He wrote something, then he looked up. "One more. Why not walk away from it? You had what you needed from the divorce. You could have taken the settlement, moved on, never engaged with any of this." She looked at the bad lighting over his left shoulder. She thought about the question, about the real answer, not the one that sounded right. "Because I've spent a long time managing things for other people's benefit and being invisible while I did it," she said. "And doing nothing with what I knew would have been one more version of that, one more time of making myself small because the alternative was inconvenient." She paused. "I'm done making myself small." He was quiet for a moment. Then he closed the notebook. "Thank you," he said. "Don't get it wrong," she said. It wasn't unfriendly. It was just what she needed him to understand. "I'm going to try very hard not to," he said. The divorce decree was finalized in the 3rd week of December. Diana called her when the court processing was complete, and Vivian was at Nell's house, which was where she and Lila had gone to decorate the small tree Nell allowed herself every year, despite professing indifference to the occasion. Lila was on the stepladder hanging an ornament, a glass bird Nell had owned for 40 years, the kind of thing that has survived by being carefully handled across decades. And Vivian stepped into the hallway to take the call. "It's done," Diana said. "The decree is filed and recorded. You are legally Vivian Sterling again." She leaned her shoulder against the hallway wall. "Okay," she said. Okay, Diana said. And then, departing from her usual economy, you did this well, Vivian. Better than most people manage when things are this complicated. I had good help. You had adequate professional representation, Diana said dryly. The rest was you. She went back into the living room where Nell was holding the stepladder and instructing Lila on ornament placement with an authority that brooked no argument. And Vivian stood in the doorway and watched them, her grandmother's hand on the ladder rail, her daughter's careful hands on the glass bird. And she felt something that was not quite a single feeling, but several at once, layered, the way actual feelings are. Relief, loss, the specific poignancy of a chapter ending, something that might, if she let it, become the beginning of something else. She went back in and picked up another ornament from the box, a small wooden one in the shape of a house, something she didn't remember seeing before, and she asked Nell where it came from. I made it, Nell said. 40 years ago. Bad craft period. Don't judge it. Vivian looked at the small wooden house. It was imperfect, uneven on one side, the painted roof slightly crooked. It had survived 40 years in a box in a house on this street, through every winter that had come and gone, through the kind of time that accumulates without announcement. She hung it on the tree. Adrian's name appeared in Malge's next piece, the one published 2 days after the new year, as a figure whose estate had been used as a financial conduit, with a careful distinction between unwitting involvement and active participation that reflected, Vivian suspected, both Mauger's accuracy and the guidance of whoever was advising Adrian's criminal attorney. The piece did not exonerate Adrian. It placed him in the complicated middle territory of someone who had benefited from a structure he had failed to properly oversee, which was, Vivian thought, about right. She read the piece and then set her phone down and did not think about Adrian Blackwood for the rest of the morning. She had work to do. Harrison Ford's lunch proposal had turned into something more formal by January, a written outline of a potential consultancy arrangement, the kind of document that was careful enough to be serious and loose enough to leave room for her input. She had read it 3 times and made 2 pages of notes and scheduled a follow-up meeting. The work he described, institutional financial accountability, structural audit, helping organizations see where the gap between their formal accounts and their actual behavior had widened, was work she understood from the inside out. She knew the language of it. She knew where the bodies were buried because she had maintained the burial records for 8 years and had subsequently used them to do something useful. That knowledge was, she was beginning to understand, not incidental to who she was. It was central. She met Harrison on a Thursday in his office. A real office this time, 7th floor, the kind with a view that looked out over the city in its winter particulars, the river gray and flat in the January light, the buildings that held the lives of the people who lived in this place. She sat across from him and they talked for 2 hours about what the work would look like, and what she would need and what she wanted and what the boundaries of the thing should be. And it was the kind of conversation where she felt consistently that her thoughts were landing accurately, being heard as what they actually were. At the end, Harrison said, "There's one more thing I want to raise." "Go ahead." "Nadia Reeves's office has been in contact with me separately. Not about you, about the investigation. But she mentioned, in a context that was not accidental, that there may be a formal role for someone with your background in the city's accountability infrastructure going forward, once the inquiry concludes. Something with the Office of Public Integrity. Vivian looked at the river out the window. What kind of role? Advisory, initially, possibly more than advisory depending on how the structural reforms shake out. He paused. It would be public. Your name would be visible in a way it hasn't been. She thought about that. She thought about the 8 years of invisibility and the year since the party and the way the world looked different when you were no longer trying to stay below its surface. "Tell Reeves I'm open to a conversation," she said. She took the train home that afternoon, which she had gotten into the habit of. It was slower than driving, but it gave her 30 minutes of motion without responsibility, the city moving past the windows, the ordinary geography of a place going about its business. She watched it go by and thought about the wooden house on Nell's tree, 40 years old and crooked and still hanging. She got off at her stop and walked the 6 blocks to Aldrich Street in the January cold, her coat not quite warm enough for how the wind was coming off the river today. and she turned onto her street and could see the light in the front window, the lamp, the one that cast the circle on the floor, from half a block away. She had left it on when she left in the morning because a house with a light on is a house that expects someone to return. She walked toward it. The formal charges against Roger Calloway were filed on a Thursday morning in February, 14 months after Vivian had stood at the east end of a terrace in a blue silk dress and set a ring down on a dessert table. She was at Harrison's office when the news came through. They were in the middle of a working session on a client engagement, a mid-sized nonprofit whose grant disbursement records had developed the kind of quiet inconsistencies that organizations develop when they grow faster than their internal controls. She had her laptop open and a spreadsheet on the screen and a coffee going cold at her elbow, and her phone buzzed with the alert and she looked at it and then set it face down and went back to the spreadsheet. Harrison saw her do it. He had, over the months of working together, developed the particular attentiveness of someone who has learned that Vivian Sterling does not make small movements without reason. "The Calloway charges?" he said. "Yes? Do you need a minute?" She looked at the spreadsheet. Column G had an anomaly she hadn't finished tracing. "No," she said. "Let me finish this first." She finished the column. She documented the anomaly. She wrote 3 sentences of notation in the working file that would tell the next person who looked at it exactly what they were seeing and why it mattered. Then she picked up her phone and read the full alert. Roger Calloway had been charged with 7 counts, 3 of financial fraud, 2 of conspiracy to misuse public infrastructure funds, and 2 of falsifying public records. Kenneth Denton, his political director, the man who had been seeding the narrative about Vivian's falsified documents at the Whitmore benefit 4 months earlier, had been charged alongside him on 2 of the conspiracy counts. 3 other individuals connected to the Ridgeline transaction chain faced separate but related charges. The article cited, without naming, a financial witness whose documentation of the Blackwood Estates accounts had provided the structural map for the investigation. She read that sentence twice. A financial witness whose documentation had provided the structural map. She thought about the kitchen table on Aldrich Street at 2 in the morning. She thought about the parallel record system she had maintained for 4 years inside a marriage that had not been looking at her. She thought about the folders in the safety deposit box, the careful annotations in the margins, the choice, made quietly, never announced, justified to herself as professional habit, to keep building the record even when she didn't know what she was building it for. The map. She had made the map. She put the phone down and looked out Harrison's window at the February city, the river hard and gray in the winter light, and she felt something that was not triumph. Triumph was too simple, too clean, and none of this had been clean. What she felt was closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you've been carrying so long you stopped noticing it was there. The relief was quiet, almost private. "You okay?" Harrison asked. "Yes," she said, and then, more honestly, "I think so. Ask me again in a few days." He nodded. He did not say anything else, which was one of the things she had come to value about working with him. He understood when to let the moment be what it was. She called Diana from the lobby on her way out. "I saw it," Diana said. 7 counts. The documentation held. Of course it held. You built it to hold. A pause. "Vivian, how are you feeling?" She stood in the lobby of the building, the unremarkable institutional lobby, the same beige as most of the important rooms her life had moved through in the past year, and she thought about the question. "I feel like I want to pick up Lila from school myself today," she said, "even though she's old enough to walk with Sophia." "Then do that," Diana said. She did that. She arrived at the school gate 10 minutes before the bell and stood on the sidewalk in the February cold, which was the real cold now, the kind that meant something. A few other parents were there. The after-school pickup crowd had thinned as the kids got older and more independent, but there were always a few standing with their phones or talking to each other with the particular ease of people who share a geography and a developmental stage without necessarily sharing much else. The woman with the sensible coat, whose name Vivian had learned was Karen, who had a son in Lila's class named Felix, nodded at her. "Cold one today." "Very," Vivian agreed. You hear there's a field trip next week? To the city planning office? Ms. Okafor apparently thinks 9-year-olds need to understand zoning law. Vivian laughed. A real one. The kind that came out before she had a chance to curate it. Lila is going to have opinions. Felix already has opinions, Karen said. I don't know where he gets them. The bell rang, and the doors opened, and the children came out in their usual organized chaos. Backpacks too large, coats half zipped, the urgent business of reuniting with the afternoon already in progress. Lila came out behind Sophia, who was wearing a hat with a pom-pom that was arguably too large for structural stability, and the two of them were in the middle of what appeared to be a debate that had been running since before the bell. Lila saw her mother and stopped mid-sentence. "You came," she said. It wasn't quite surprise. It was more like recognition, the noting of something that mattered. "I came," Vivian said. Lila came to her and leaned into the hug with her full weight, which she rarely did anymore. 9 was already developing its own sense of self-containment, and Vivian held her and felt the familiar geometry of her daughter, the specific weight and warmth of her. "Sophia thinks the city planning office is boring," Lila said into her shoulder. "It's not boring if you know what to look for," Vivian said. Lila pulled back and looked at her with that careful, appraising look that she'd had since she was 4 years old. "You know about city planning?" "I know about the part where the decisions and the paperwork don't always match," Vivian said. Lila considered this. "That sounds like it could be interesting." "It could be. We'll talk about it on the walk home." They walked the 4 blocks in the cold, Lila with her pom-pom hat companion, until Sophia peeled off at the corner, and then just the two of them on the last stretch. And Vivian talked about what city planning actually was, about the gap her daughter had identified back in October between geography and power, about how the decisions that shaped a city lived inside documents that most people never read, and about why that mattered. Lila listened the way she listened to things that engaged her, fully, without performing attention, asking 2 questions that were better than most adults would have asked. They got home. Vivian made tea. Lila did homework at the kitchen table with the pencil behind her ear, which was now simply a permanent feature of her presence. And the kitchen was warm, and the light was the same warm circle on the floor, and outside the February dark was coming early the way it did, pulling the afternoon down fast. This was the life on Aldrich Street. It was not large. It was not what she had expected her life to look like. It was, she had come to understand, more genuinely hers than anything she had lived inside before. The meeting with Nadia Reeves about the Office of Public Integrity role happened 3 weeks after the Calloway charges were filed. The investigation was still ongoing. Calloway had entered a not guilty plea. His attorneys were doing what expensive attorneys do, and the process would unfold at the pace that legal processes unfold. But Reeves was already thinking about the structural questions. What had allowed the Ridgeline scheme to operate for as long as it had? What gaps in the city's oversight mechanisms had made it invisible? How those gaps could be addressed in ways that were durable rather than cosmetic. The advisory role she described was not glamorous. It involved reviewing existing financial control frameworks across city-adjacent institutions, the kinds of systems that lived in the middle administrative layers that no one paid attention to until something went wrong. Identifying vulnerabilities, building documentation standards, training people to keep the kinds of records that could survive scrutiny. It was, in other words, exactly what Vivian had been doing for free inside a household for 8 years. "It's a 2-year appointment," Reeves said. "The compensation is public sector. I won't pretend otherwise. But the position has real authority, and the people who take it seriously have shaped things in ways that lasted." Vivian sat across from her in the same office, the same Cleveland coffee mug, the same quality of direct attention that she had appreciated from the first meeting. "What do you actually need from someone in this role?" "Someone who understands that the gap between how systems say they work and how they actually work is where everything important happens," Reeves said. "And someone who isn't impressed by the people who benefit from keeping that gap invisible." Vivian thought about 8 years of maintaining 2 sets of understanding, the official version of the estate's operations and the version that was actually true. She thought about the 4 years of parallel records, the discrepancy log, the careful annotations in the margins that no one had asked her to make, and no one had known existed until she needed them to matter. "I can do this alongside the consultancy work with Harrison?" she asked. "The appointment is structured to accommodate it. We want your perspective from both directions, the private institutional side and the public accountability side. That combination is actually what makes it useful." Vivian was quiet for a moment. She looked at the window, the same west-facing window she'd looked through in October, the light different now, the city different now, both of them moving through time at the same pace. "All right," she said. Reeves nodded. No celebration, just the quiet acknowledgement of two people who have agreed on something that matters and are both ready to get to work. The appointment was announced publicly in March, in a brief item in the city section of the daily paper. Stephen Moggier wrote 3 paragraphs on it that placed it in the context of the Callaway investigation and the broader structural reforms being discussed at the city level. He identified Vivian by name and by her role in the investigation, carefully, accurately, with the precision she had asked him for, and that he had, over several months of careful background conversations, consistently demonstrated. She read the piece at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with her first cup of coffee. She had been braced for something, for the feeling of exposure that she expected to come with having her name in print in connection with something this public. What she found instead was quieter. Her name was in 3 paragraphs in a story about accountability infrastructure and institutional reform. It was accurate. It reflected something real. She drank her coffee and moved on to the rest of the morning. What she had not anticipated, and what took her somewhat by surprise in the weeks that followed, was the correspondence. It started slowly. Through Diana's office at first, people who had seen the Mogger piece or the AG's announcement and had looked up Vivian Sterling and found a way to send a message. Not many, but steady. Women, mostly, though not exclusively. People who had been inside institutions, marriages, corporations, organizations, where they had held things together invisibly and had eventually reached a point where invisible became untenable. Some of them were still inside those institutions. Some had already left. Some were trying to figure out which they were doing. They did not write to ask her for advice, exactly. They wrote because they needed someone who had been where they were to have come out the other side in a way that was real and not sanitized. They needed the version that included the fear and the 2 a.m. ceiling and the damp feet from walking in November without a hat. They needed to know the messy middle, not the clean resolution. She wrote back to each one. Not at length. She did not have the bandwidth for length, but specifically because generic comfort was its own kind of dismissal. She wrote the thing that was actually true for her particular situation, and she let that be what it was. Margot, who had come through the past year with her friendship intact and her understanding of Vivian considerably deepened, read one of these responses over Vivian's shoulder one evening when they were having dinner at Nell's house, a gathering that had become a loose monthly habit, the 3 of them around Nell's kitchen table with the herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, and said, "You should do more of this." "I'm already doing the OPI work and the consultancy," Vivian said. "I don't mean professionally, I mean this thing where you say the true thing directly to someone who needs to hear it. That's just talking." "It's not just talking." Margot had a particular expression when she meant something and was deciding whether Vivian would accept it, a slight setting of the jaw. "It's the thing you do where you see past what someone is performing and you address what's actually happening." Nell, at the end of the table, did not look up from her bread. "She's right," she said. Vivian looked at her grandmother. Nell was 71 and had the serene authority of someone who had outlasted enough situations to trust her own assessments. "You're both ganging up on me," Vivian said. "Yes," Nell agreed. She thought about what Margot had said for several weeks after that dinner. She thought about it in the particular way she thought about things that didn't have clean answers, not trying to solve them, just keeping them in peripheral vision while the other work continued. The other work continued. The OPI role was exactly as unglamorous as Reeves had warned. Long sessions reviewing control frameworks that had been designed by committee and implemented by people who didn't fully understand them, finding the points of failure that lived in the gap between the design and the reality, writing recommendations that were specific and defensible and useful to people who would need to act on them without her being there to explain. It was the kind of work that didn't produce visible results quickly, that required believing in the value of building things that worked properly even when no one was watching. She believed in that. She had always believed in that, even when it had cost her to do so. Adrian was part of the picture, and that required its own ongoing navigation. He had come through the legal exposure of the investigation in a position that was uncomfortable but not catastrophic. The criminal attorney he'd hired in October had been good, and the careful distinction in the public accounting between active participation and negligent oversight had held. He had not been charged. He had, however, been publicly associated with a significant corruption scheme through the estate he'd inherited and failed to properly govern, and that association had consequences in the social and professional circles where his name had once opened doors. He had sold Ashford Manor in January. The house, the terrace, the East End where she had stood in the blue silk dress, the gardenias, the hand-blown glass, had been sold to a developer who was converting it to a small hotel. She found out from Margot and felt nothing particular about it, which was its own kind of information about where she was. The visits with Lila had continued and, slowly, had improved in the specific way that required time rather than effort. Not because Adrian had made dramatic gestures. He had learned, apparently through the accumulated feedback of watching his daughter's face, that Lila was not responsive to dramatic gestures, but because he had shown up consistently and on time and had started learning the things about his daughter that you learn by paying attention rather than by being told. He knew about Sophia. He knew about the pencil behind the ear. He had taken Lila to a city planning exhibit at the Civic Museum. Her field trip to the planning office had apparently ignited something, and had sent Vivian a text afterward that said simply, "She asked 7 questions the docent couldn't answer." I was proud of her. Vivian had read that text and had held it for a moment and had thought, this is what the arithmetic of time produces if you let it. Not reconciliation, not erasure of what happened. Something more practical and in some ways more valuable. A man learning, belatedly and imperfectly, to be a present parent. The damage he had done to their marriage was real, and it was not forgiven in any tidy sense. But it was possible to hold that truth alongside a different truth, that the father Lila would know going forward might be a better version than the one who had stood on a terrace and not looked at his wife. People were capable of learning. Vivian was not naive enough to believe they always did. She was realistic enough to acknowledge it when they appeared to be. She and Adrian spoke on the phone every week, brief, practical, about Lila's schedule or a school matter, or something that required coordination. The calls were not warm exactly. They were civil in a way that had been earned rather than assumed, which was different from the civility that had characterized the last years of their marriage, the surface smoothness that had concealed the withdrawal underneath. One evening in April, he called at an unusual time, 7:30, when Lila was still up. "Is Lila there?" he asked. "She's upstairs. Do you want to talk to her?" "In a minute. I wanted to—" He paused. "I wanted to say something to you first." She waited. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for a while, and I haven't found a version that doesn't sound like it's asking for something. So I'm just going to say it." Another pause. "I didn't see you. For a long time. And what I've learned since, from the mediation, from the investigation, from watching Lila, is that not seeing you wasn't a passive thing. It required actual effort to not see what you were doing. You have to work at that kind of blindness." A beat. "I'm sorry for the work I put into not seeing you." Vivian was in the kitchen. The lamp was on, the circle of light on the floor. She thought about the thing she could say, the thing that would be gracious and complete and let him off cleanly. She didn't say that. She didn't say the hard version either. She said what was true. "I know you are," she said, "and I think Lila is going to benefit from the person you're becoming. That matters more to me than the apology." A silence. "That's a hard thing to say to someone," he said. "But it's also, yeah, it's fair." "Go talk to your daughter," she said. "She has opinions about zoning law." She heard something that might have been a laugh, brief, surprised. "I know, she sent me a voice memo about setback requirements." Vivian did laugh at that. Of course she did. She called Lila down and handed her the phone and went back to the kitchen table. And outside, the April evening was warm enough that she had the window open an inch, and the night was coming in through the gap, and she could hear Lila upstairs explaining something to her father with the particular intensity she brought to explaining things she cared about. The Callaway trial began in September. Vivian was called to give testimony in the second week. She had known this was coming. Reeves had prepared her, Diana had prepared her, and she had prepared herself in the way she prepared for most things, by going through the material until she knew it cold, and then letting herself not think about it in the nights before until she actually needed to. The courthouse was a building she had driven past 100 times and never entered. It was large and institutional and smelled of the particular combination of floor polish and recycled air that official buildings shared, and she walked through it on the morning of her testimony in a gray suit she had bought for this occasion. Not because she believed clothing determined outcomes, but because she was a person who took the preparation of small things seriously. She was on the stand for 4 hours. The prosecution's questions were direct, and she answered them directly. The transaction structure, the authorization chain, the discrepancy between the formal records and the actual routing of funds. The moment she had understood that what she was seeing connected to something outside the Blackwood household. She answered without editorializing, without performing emotion, without looking anywhere except at the attorney who had asked the question or at the documents on the screen. The defense cross-examination tried 3 approaches: questioning the accuracy of her record-keeping, questioning her motivation as a witness given the divorce, and questioning whether her access to the documents had been authorized. She answered each approach the same way, specifically with reference to the documentation, without rising to the emotional temperature the defense attorney was trying to establish. At one point, the defense attorney said, "Isn't it true, Ms. Sterling, that you maintained these records without your husband's knowledge?" "Yes," she said. "Without authorization?" "My authorization to maintain the estate's financial records was implicit in the role I performed for 8 years. The parallel documentation I created was a separate personal record of discrepancies I observed. No one authorized me to notice things that didn't add up. People rarely are." The defense attorney paused. "No further questions," he said. She left the stand and walked back through the courtroom and out into the corridor, and she sat on a bench near a window that looked out at the September city, and she stayed there for 5 minutes without thinking about anything in particular. Reeves came out a few minutes later and sat beside her. "You were good in there," Reeves said. "I was accurate in there," Vivian said. "That's the most I can take credit for." "In that room, being accurate is the harder thing." Reeves looked out the window. "You understand that what you built, the documentation, the record, that's going to be the thing that makes this conviction stick or not. Not the attorneys, not the procedural arguments, the records." Vivian looked at the city in the September light. "Someone was going to notice eventually," she said. "I was just the person who happened to be in the room." Reeves looked at her with the expression she had worn in their first meeting, the one adjacent to respect. "Most people in the room don't notice," she said, "and most people who notice don't keep records, and most people who keep records don't do anything with them." She paused. "You did all 3. That's not accident." Vivian thought about that. She thought about the years of maintenance, the systems she had built and tended inside a household that had not seen her doing it, the records that had been, as much as anything, an act of faith that keeping them would eventually mean something even when it was not yet clear what. The verdict came in late November, guilty on 5 of 7 counts, with the conspiracy charges resulting in additional sentencing considerations. Denton pled guilty to his charges 2 weeks before the verdict, which prosecutors had anticipated. The 3 individuals connected to the Ridgeline chain received separate judgments in proceedings that ran through the following spring. Vivian followed the verdict coverage on her phone on a Tuesday evening at Nell's house, where she and Lila had come for dinner. Lila was helping Nell with something in the kitchen, the particular focused collaboration of a 9-year-old who takes cooking assistance seriously. And Vivian was at the kitchen table when the alert came through. She read it, set her phone down, looked at the kitchen, her grandmother's kitchen, the herbs on the ceiling beams, the familiar smell of something roasting, the sound of Lila asking Nell why you salt water before you add pasta. "So the pasta has something to taste," Nell said. "But the pasta doesn't taste salt," Lila said. "It just absorbs it." "That's what I said." "You said—" Lila stopped, reconsidering. "Okay, that is what you said." Vivian sat at the table and listened to her daughter and her grandmother argue about the chemistry of pasta water. And outside it was November again, a full year since the settlement, 2 years since the party. And the herbs on the ceiling beams were the same herbs they had always been. And the house was the same house it had always been. And she was not the same person she had been when she had last sat in this kitchen in crisis. She was tired. She was not finished. The OPI work would continue, the consultancy would continue, the correspondence from people who needed to hear the real version would continue. There were things she had not yet figured out about her own life, about what she wanted beyond the immediate horizon. She was 38 years old and she was not, in any meaningful sense, done. But she was here. She was present. She was seated at the center of a life that had been assembled by her own choices, the hard ones and the imperfect ones, and the ones she had made at 2 a.m. when the only honest company was the ceiling above her bed. She thought about what she had learned, not the tactical things. Those were real, but they were not the lesson. The lesson was something she could not have been told. It had to be lived, had to be arrived at through the specific sequence of her own choices and failures and small persistent acts of keeping records when no one was watching. It was this. Visibility is not something that is granted to you by the people around you. It is something you build through the quality of your attention to your own life and to the things that matter, until the structures you've created become undeniable even to the people who would have preferred not to see them. You do not become visible by making yourself loud. You become visible by building things that last. She had been building things her whole life. She had just, for too long, been building them for other people's houses. "Dinner," Nell called. Not loudly. Nell never called loudly. She simply said the word as a fact, and it was enough. Vivian got up and went to the kitchen. The three of them sat around Nell's table, the same kitchen, the same lamp over the table casting the same quality of light it had cast for 40 years in this house. They ate the chicken thing and the roasted carrots and the bread from the freezer, and Lila told them both about a project she was developing with Sophia on the history of the city's waterway system, which she described as fundamentally a story about who controlled the routes and therefore controlled what could move through them. "That's exactly what it is," Vivian said. Lila looked pleased. "Sophia thinks the waterways are just interesting historically. I think they're interesting because the same arguments are still happening." "They are," Vivian said. "The arguments never fully resolve. The terrain just shifts." "Is that depressing?" Lila asked. Vivian thought about the question. She thought about Roger Calloway in a courtroom, and the ridgeline documents on Nadia Reeves's desk, and the wedding ring on the dessert table among the petite fours, and the 4 years of records in a safety deposit box, and the lamp on in the window of the house on Aldrich Street that she had left on because a house with a light expects someone to come back. "No," she said. "It means the work keeps being worth doing." Lila considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that engaged her fully. Then she picked up her fork and returned to the chicken thing, and Nell refilled the water glasses without being asked, and outside the November dark held the city in its ordinary keeping. The wooden house was on Nell's tree in the living room. Vivian could see it from the kitchen doorway, the slightly crooked roof, the 40 years of surviving intact. She had put it there again this year, as she had the year before, as she suspected she would again. Because some things that are imperfect and handmade and slightly lopsided are worth putting somewhere visible and leaving there, as evidence of the kind of thing that lasts, not because it was perfect, but because someone kept it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went back to the table, where her daughter and her grandmother were arguing about the waterway system with the focused energy of people who find the world endlessly worth arguing about, and she sat down and picked up her fork and joined them.